Hello, everyone. Tonight we are going on an epic journey tracing the rise and fall of Chinese dynasties, a saga spanning millennia that will leave you breathless and, frankly, a little cold. Because let's be honest, you probably won't survive this level of historical density without a hot beverage and a blanket. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you in the comments below. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. Imagine you're standing on the banks of a mighty muddy river, the Yellow River, to be precise. The sun, a hazy orange disk, dips below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the nascent settlements. Around you, people in simple homespun clothes are going about their evening chores, the scent of wood smoke mingling with the damp earth. This isn't just any river. It's the cradle of Chinese civilization, a place where myths and history intertwine like ancient tree roots. You're about to step into the very, very beginning, a time so distant it feels more like a dream than a historical record. We're talking about the Xia Dynasty, a period that historians still debate whether it was a real unified state or a collection of tribal chiefdoms that grew into legend. For centuries, the Xia was considered purely mythical, a convenient origin story for a grand civilization. But archaeological discoveries, particularly at sites like Erlitou, have started to unearth evidence that aligns with some of these ancient accounts. You might find fragments of sophisticated bronze vessels, indications of urban planning, and even early forms of writing that hint at a more complex society than previously imagined. It's like finding a dog-eared photo album from your great-great-grandparents that suddenly makes their tall tales feel a little more tangible. The stories tell of Yu the Great, a legendary figure who tamed the Yellow River's devastating floods, a feat so monumental it supposedly earned him the mandate to rule. Now, taming a river the size of the Yellow River in ancient times, that's like trying to herd cats while riding a unicycle. It's going to be a messy, almost impossible task. And yet this tale emphasizes the crucial role of flood control in early Chinese society, a recurring theme throughout its history. Following the Xie, if you believe the traditional narrative, came the Shang Dynasty, which emerges from the mists of legend into much firmer historical ground. Think of it as transitioning from a grainy, sepia-toned photograph to a slightly faded but still discernible color snapshot. The Shang ruling from roughly 1600 to 1046 BCE represents China's true Bronze Age powerhouse. Their cities, particularly Anyang, the last Shang capital, reveal an astonishing level of organization and artistry. You'd walk through streets bustling with artisans, soldiers, and priests, all operating within a highly structured society. One of the most authoritative historical facts about the Shang is their use of oracle bones. These weren't just any old bones, they were typically plastrons from turtles or scapulae from oxen used for divination. Priests would carve questions into them, then apply heat, causing the bone to crack. The patterns of these cracks were then interpreted as divine answers. It's essentially the world's oldest known magic 8-ball, but with significantly higher stakes and less plastic. The fascinating thing about these bones is that the questions and answers often detailed everything from weather forecasts and crop yields to military campaigns and royal toothaches. The script on these oracle bones is also the earliest known form of Chinese writing directly ancestral to the characters used today. It's pretty wild to think that the same writing system, albeit evolved, has been in continuous use for over 3 millennia. Beyond the bones, the Shang were masters of bronze metallurgy. You'd see intricate ritual vessels, weapons, and tools all cast with remarkable precision. These weren't just utilitarian objects. They were works of art reflecting a society with advanced technological know-how and a rich ceremonial life. Imagine trying to explain to a Shang craftsman that one day people would carry supercomputers in their pockets, capable of predicting weather, without cracking a turtle shell. They'd probably think you were trying to sell them snake oil, or perhaps just a very inefficient form of divination. The Shang kings held immense power, acting as intermediaries between the human and spirit worlds, conducting elaborate sacrifices to ancestors and deities. Their society was highly stratified with a ruling elite, a class of skilled artisans, and a vast agricultural population. Historians still debate whether the Shang was a truly centralized empire or a network of allied tribute-paying states. This uncertainty keeps the academic world buzzing, much like a particularly stubborn mosquito on a warm summer night. As the Shang dynasty solidified its grip on power, you could practically feel the hum of industry from their bustling centers. The Yellow River, ever the lifeblood and occasional bane, carried timber minerals and agricultural bounty to these growing urban hubs. Imagine the sounds, the rhythmic clang of bronze being hammered, the chatter of merchants hawking their wares, and the hushed incantations of priests overseeing rituals. The Shang weren't just about fancy bronzeware and bone cracking. They were innovators. They developed a sophisticated calendar system surprisingly accurate for its time, and a rudimentary but effective bureaucracy to manage their expanding territories. You might spot scribes, their hands smudged with ink, meticulously recording events on bamboo slips, setting the precedent for millennia of meticulous Chinese record-keeping. The Shang's bronze technology, as we touched upon, was truly exceptional. They mastered piece mold casting, a method that allowed for incredibly intricate designs far more elaborate than anything seen in the West at the time. You wouldn't just see simple pots. You'd find massive cauldrons, ceremonial axes, and drinking vessels often adorned with fearsome Taoidi masks, stylized animal faces with bulging eyes that look like they've just had their morning coffee. And then some. These bronze artifacts weren't just for show. They were symbols of power and status used in ancestor worship and important state ceremonies. Possessing them was a direct manifestation of divine favor, a sort of ancient flex, if you will. One quirky or off-topic fact: did you know that the earliest known evidence of silk production comes from Qing Dynasty sites? You might stumble upon tiny silk fibers meticulously woven, showing that even back then, the Chinese were already pioneering the luxurious textile that would later become a global sensation. So next time you're enjoying a smooth silk scarf, picture a Shang craftsman probably trying to untangle a stubborn thread, totally oblivious to the future fashion empire they were laying the groundwork for. It's a good reminder that even ancient people had their own versions of first-world problems. The Shang kings, as divine intermediaries, held immense authority, but their rule wasn't always smooth sailing. Their expansion often led to conflicts with neighboring tribes, some of whom they enslaved for labor or sacrificed during elaborate rituals. Yes, it was a different time and not one for the faint of heart. The capital cities were moved multiple times throughout the dynasty's history, perhaps due to floods, resource depletion, or simply the need for a fresh start after a particularly nasty plague. Historians still debate whether these shifts were strategic moves to consolidate power or forced migrations due to environmental pressures. It's hard to say for sure, but imagine having to pack up an entire Bronze Age metropolis and move it. Your moving day would look like a walk in the park compared to theirs. Their religious practices were deeply ingrained in their daily lives. Ancestor worship was paramount, believing that deceased ancestors could influence the living world. This meant constant offering sacrifices and consultations via those oracle bones. It was a bit like having a direct hotline to your deceased relatives, except they only answered in cryptic cracks, and you needed a priest to translate. This reverence for ancestors laid a foundational stone for later Chinese social and ethical structures, emphasizing filial piety and continuity. The Shang dynasty's eventual downfall around 1046 BCE came at the hands of the Zhou, a less culturally developed but militarily ascendant group from the west. The traditional narrative describes the last Shang king, King Zhou, as a decadent and tyrannical ruler, so depraved that heaven withdrew its mandate. He supposedly indulged in lavish orgies, built a pond of wine, and a forest of meat, which sounds less like a party and more like a food waste nightmare, and tortured his loyal officials. This moral decay, so the story goes, justified the Zhou conquest. It's a classic bad ruler gets his comeuppance tale designed to legitimize the new dynasty. While the specifics are likely embellished, the underlying truth is that the Shang, for all its brilliance, eventually became overstretched and internally weakened, ripe for a challenge from a new energetic power. You can almost hear the whispered rumors in the markets, the growing discontent long before the first Zhou arrow flew. And so, as the final, perhaps self-inflicted party of the Shang dynasty wound down amidst their mythical meat forests, a new power was gathering force in the West, the Zhou dynasty. You can almost picture them, a hardy, pragmatic people watching from the sidelines as the Shang indulged in excess. They weren't just a random group. They had been allies, even vassals of the Shang, learning much from their more advanced neighbors. But every good student eventually surpasses their teacher, and the Zhou certainly did. Their conquest of the Shang around 1046 BCE marked a pivotal moment in Chinese history, not just for the change in leadership, but for the profound ideological shift they brought with them. This shift was encapsulated in the concept of the Paul Mandate of Heaven. Tianming. This is an authoritative historical fact that fundamentally shaped Chinese political thought for millennia. The Zhou rulers didn't just say, "We beat the Shang, so we're in charge now." That's a bit too crude for a civilization as sophisticated as theirs. Instead, they articulated a divine justification for their rule. Heaven, a cosmic power, granted legitimacy to a just ruler. If a ruler became tyrannical, corrupt, or incompetent, heaven would withdraw its mandate, leading to natural disasters, famines, and popular unrest, signaling that it was time for a new dynasty. It was a brilliant piece of political propaganda, really a spiritual rubber stamp for regime change. It also served as a constant check on power, at least in theory, reminding future emperors that their authority wasn't absolute and depended on their virtue. This idea reverberated through every subsequent dynasty, a silent warning etched into the very fabric of Chinese governance. Imagine the Zhou king standing atop a newly conquered Shang palace, perhaps a bit dusty from the journey, proclaiming to the masses that the Shang had lost heaven's favor. It was a powerful narrative, far more persuasive than simply wielding a bigger bronze axe. It gave the new rulers a moral high ground and offered a cyclical view of history, where dynasties rose, flourished, declined, and were eventually replaced. It's like a cosmic report card, and the Shang clearly got a failing grade in good governance. Now for a quirky or off-topic fact. The Zhou period also saw the development of iron metallurgy in China, though bronze remained dominant for ritualistic purposes. But iron, that's like discovering plastic for the first time. It's cheaper, more abundant, and revolutionary for tools and weapons. So while the Zhou were busy establishing their mandate of heaven somewhere in a dusty workshop, a blacksmith was probably tinkering with iron, unknowingly forging the tools for future agricultural booms and even bloodier wars. The early Zhou period, known as the Western Zhou c. 1046–701 BCE, was relatively stable. They expanded their territory, establishing a decentralized feudal system where land was granted to loyal relatives and vassals in exchange for military service and tribute. This system, while effective, initially contained the seeds of its own destruction, a bit like setting up a bunch of mini-kingdoms and hoping they always play nice. You'd find local lords with their own small armies managing their fiefdoms while still nominally pledging allegiance to the Zhou king. It was a complex web of loyalties and obligations, much like trying to keep track of who owes whom a favor after a particularly lively potluck dinner. The philosophical innovations weren't just limited to the mandate of heaven. This period also saw the nascent stirrings of what would become the 100 schools of thought, laying the groundwork for Confucianism and Daoism, which we'll delve into more deeply later. Think of it as a historical intellectual explosion with thinkers pondering ethics, governance, and the very nature of existence. Historians still debate whether the Zhou's feudal system was a deliberate, well-planned political structure or an organic evolution based on the realities of managing a vast and newly conquered territory. It's a bit of a chicken or egg question, isn't it? Was it intentional design or just a pragmatic response to sprawling new borders and the inherent challenges of communication in an era before instant messaging? As the centuries passed, the Western Zhou's grip on power began to loosen. The feudal lords, growing stronger and more independent, started to challenge the central authority. Border invasions from nomadic tribes in the west became more frequent and devastating. Finally, in 771 BCE, a coalition of rebellious vassals and nomadic raiders sacked the Zhou capital Haojing. This event marked the end of the Western Zhou and forced the royal court to flee eastward, establishing a new capital at Luoyang. This began the Eastern Zhou period, but it was a Zhou with a vastly diminished power, a king in name, only essentially a spiritual figurehead, with little real political or military clout. The power had irrevocably shifted to the regional states, setting the stage for an era of unprecedented chaos and intellectual ferment. The relentless, almost Sisyphean struggle of the spring and autumn period, with its endless array of skirmishes and shifting alliances, created an unexpected side effect. It was a golden age for intellectual thought. You see, when society is in flux, when the old order is crumbling, people start asking big questions. Why are things so chaotic? How can we achieve order? What makes a good ruler or a good person? This fertile ground gave rise to the 100 schools of thought, a vibrant tapestry of philosophical ideas that would profoundly shape Chinese civilization for millennia. It's like everyone suddenly decided to become a self-help guru, but instead of hawking questionable diets, they were offering profound insights into governance, ethics, and human nature. Among these myriad voices, two stood out like philosophical rock stars: Confucius and Laozi. Let's start with Confucius, or Confuzi, as he was known in his time. Born in the state of Lu around 551 BCE, Confucius lived through the heart of the spring and autumn period's turmoil. He wasn't a king or a general. He was a teacher, a scholar, and a frustrated civil servant who believed that societal harmony could be restored through ethical conduct and moral cultivation. Imagine him, a kind-faced, earnest man, patiently explaining his ideas to a small group of disciples, perhaps under a willow tree, while the sounds of distant battles occasionally drifted on the wind. An authoritative historical fact about Confucius is that his teachings, primarily recorded by his disciples in the Analects, emphasize the importance of Ren humanity, benevolence, Li ritual, propriety, and Yai righteousness. He believed that if individuals cultivated these virtues, starting with the ruler and extending through all levels of society, order would naturally follow. It was a top-down approach, focusing on leading by moral example rather than by force. He advocated for a return to the idealized social order of the early Zhou, a time he saw as harmonious and just. He believed in the power of education and that anyone, regardless of birth, could become a gentleman, junzi, through learning and self-improvement. This was revolutionary in a world still largely bound by aristocratic privilege. For a quirky or off-topic fact, Confucius was reportedly quite tall for his time, around 6 feet 3 inches, so while he was dispensing profound wisdom, he was also literally looking down on many of his contemporaries. Perhaps that added a certain gravitas to his philosophical arguments, or maybe it just meant he had a better view at public debates. You never know what little details can influence a historical figure's presence. Then there was Daoism, often associated with the enigmatic figure of Laozi, who some scholars believe was a contemporary of Confucius, though historians still debate whether he was a single historical person or a composite of various early Taoist thinkers. While Confucius focused on active engagement with society to fix its problems, Daoism advocated a different path, one of harmony with nature and a retreat from the rigidities of societal norms. Imagine Laozi, perhaps a wise old hermit, chuckling gently at the futility of human striving, preferring to wander freely among the mountains. The core text of Taoism is the Tao Te Ching, a short, poetic, and often paradoxical work. Its central concept is the Tao the Way, an ineffable underlying cosmic force that guides all things. Taoists believe that true harmony came from living in accordance with the Tao, embracing simplicity, spontaneity, and a concept called Wu Wei, non-action or effortless action. This doesn't mean doing nothing but rather acting in a way that is natural and flows with the current of the universe rather than forcing things against their natural grain. It's like trying to paddle upstream versus letting the river carry you gently downstream. Trying to control everything for a Taoist was the path to suffering. They often viewed Confucian efforts to impose strict rules and rituals as artificial and ultimately counterproductive. The contrast between these two philosophies is stark. Confucianism focused on social order, ethics, and active participation. Taoism emphasizing individual harmony, naturalness, and a certain detachment from worldly concerns. It's like the difference between a meticulously planned urban garden and a wild, untamed forest. Both have their beauty, but they achieve it in very different ways. Other schools of thought also flourished, such as legalism, which argued for strict laws and centralized power, and Mohism, which promoted universal love and pacifism. It was a true marketplace of ideas where philosophers traveled from state to state, offering their insights to rulers desperate for solutions to the endless chaos. This intellectual ferment, though born from conflict, provided the bedrock for much of China's future cultural and political development, reminding us that even in the darkest times, the human mind can blossom with profound creativity. The intellectual fireworks of the 100 schools of thought, though brilliant, couldn't mask the underlying reality. The spring and autumn period was essentially a slow-motion collapse into even greater chaos. As the Zhou king became increasingly irrelevant, the powerful regional states, emboldened by their growing strength and shrinking respect for central authority, stopped playing nice altogether. This escalation marks the beginning of the Warring States period from roughly 475 BCE to 221 BCE. If the spring and autumn period was a playground squabble, the Warring States period was a brutal, no-holds-barred gladiatorial arena where only one could emerge victorious. Imagine the landscape of China transformed. Instead of dozens of small squabbling fiefdoms, you now have 7 major powers: Qi Chu Yan Han Jiao Wei and Qin. These weren't just states. They were budding empires, each with massive armies, sophisticated bureaucracies, and a relentless ambition to conquer all rivals. The nature of warfare changed dramatically. Gone were the chivalrous chariot-based battles of earlier times. This was total war, fought on an unprecedented scale with mass infantry siege engines and cunning espionage. It's like graduating from a polite fencing match to a full-on muddy, bloody brawl with thousands of participants. An authoritative historical fact about the Warring States period is the widespread adoption of iron weaponry and armor. While iron appeared earlier, its refinement and mass production during this era revolutionized warfare. Soldiers now equipped with durable iron swords, spears, and crossbows could engage in much longer and more destructive engagements. Combine that with the introduction of conscription, allowing states to field armies of hundreds of thousands, and you have a recipe for unparalleled carnage. The crossbow, in particular, was a game-changer, allowing a relatively untrained soldier to project lethal force from a distance, rendering aristocratic charioteers less relevant. For a quirky or off-topic fact during this period, despite all the bloodshed, there was a surprising advancement in ancient Chinese plumbing. Some states developed elaborate ceramic pipe systems for drainage and even for bringing fresh water to their cities. So while armies were hacking each other to pieces on the battlefield somewhere in a nascent city, an ancient plumber was probably complaining about a clog totally oblivious to the epic scale of the surrounding conflict. It just goes to show, even in the most tumultuous times, people still need to well go. The philosophical ideas we discussed earlier didn't just vanish. They evolved to fit the new ruthless reality. Legalism, which had been a minor voice, gained significant traction. Unlike Confucianism's emphasis on virtue, legalism advocated for strict laws, a powerful centralized government, and harsh punishments to maintain order. Think of it as the ultimate tough love approach to governance. Philosophers like Han Fei argued that human nature was inherently selfish and that only a strong state backed by unambiguous laws could prevent chaos. Rulers desperate for a path to unification often found legalism's pragmatic, results-oriented approach very appealing. It was like offering a clear, albeit brutal, instruction manual to power rather than a philosophical treatise on moral improvement. Historians still debate whether the legalist policies, particularly those adopted by the state of Qin, were a necessary evil for unification or a brutal path that ultimately led to the Qin's rapid collapse. Was the Iron Fist truly the only way to forge a unified China from the crucible of war, or did it sow the seeds of its own destruction by alienating the populace? It's a fascinating question echoing through the centuries. The state of Qin, located in the western periphery, steadily gained an advantage. They were known for their harsh but effective legalist reforms, their strong military, and their ability to absorb and integrate conquered populations. While other states were squabbling amongst themselves, the Qin were systematically building their strength like a patient predator watching its prey exhaust itself. They implemented policies that rewarded agricultural production and military merit, fostering a highly efficient and disciplined society geared towards war. You can imagine the dread that spread as news of Qin's latest victory reached the other capitals, a chilling realization that this was no ordinary opponent. The long drawn-out process of unification was about to reach its violent climax, ushering in an entirely new chapter for China. The stage was set, the players assembled, and the brutal game of unification had reached its crescendo. After centuries of fragmentation, political maneuvering, and relentless warfare, one state, the Cixin, stood poised to sweep away the remnants of the old order. You can imagine the tension in the air across what would become China, the constant dread of the Qin war machine known for its ruthless efficiency and unwavering determination. Their rise wasn't accidental. It was the culmination of decades, even centuries, of adopting and perfecting the harsh, pragmatic doctrines of legalism. The man who would become the architect of this unprecedented unification was Yingzheng, who ascended the Qin throne in 247 BCE at the tender age of 13. He was a force of nature, a visionary with an iron will and an almost fanatical belief in his own destiny. You can picture him as a young king, his gaze intense, absorbing every lesson in statecraft and military strategy, patiently waiting for the moment to unleash his ambition upon the world. He understood that to unite China, he couldn't just defeat his enemies. He had to utterly dismantle their systems, their identities, and their very existence as independent entities. It was less about winning battles and more about erasing the board. An authoritative historical fact about the Qin dynasty's unification is that it was achieved through a series of relentless military campaigns waged against the remaining 6 major warring states. From 230 BCE to 221 BCE, Yingzheng systematically conquered Han, Chu Yan, and finally Qi. Each victory was meticulously planned, executed with brutal precision, and followed by the immediate imposition of Qin's centralized administrative system. It was a swift, brutal, and utterly transformative decade that forever changed the political landscape of China. Imagine the scale armies of hundreds of thousands clashing cities besieged, an entire population subjected to a new, unfamiliar rule. For a quirky or off-topic fact during these unification wars, one of the Qin's secret weapons wasn't just their superior military organization, but also their use of a standardized crossbow trigger mechanism. This meant that crossbow parts were interchangeable, allowing for mass production and easy repair on the battlefield. It's the ancient equivalent of having universal spare parts, a simple but brilliant logistical advantage. So while other armies might be struggling with a broken crossbow, the Qin soldier could swap out a piece and be back in the fight, delivering a lethal bolt with unnerving efficiency. Upon completing his conquests in 221 BCE, Yingzheng proclaimed himself not just a king but Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China. This act was monumental. He was deliberately breaking with the Zhou tradition, rejecting the title of king to signal a new, unprecedented era. The title, emperor, Huangdi itself, was a fusion of two ancient terms for supreme deities or mythical rulers, asserting a divine authority far beyond any previous monarch. You can almost hear the trumpets blaring, the crowds roaring as he officially declared this new unified empire. It was a moment of immense historical gravity, a line in the sand separating the old fragmented world from a bold, if terrifying, new one. Historians still debate whether Qin Shi Huang's unification methods, while undeniably brutal, were a necessary evil to pull China out of centuries of internecine warfare. Was the Iron Fist truly the only way to forge a singular identity from so many disparate states, or could a less autocratic approach have achieved similar results with less suffering? It's a compelling question, one that continues to spark academic arguments like rival philosophers in ancient taverns. The first emperor immediately set about consolidating his power and standardizing everything. He abolished the old feudal system, dividing the empire into commanderies and counties administered by centrally appointed officials. This was a radical break from the decentralized Zhou model, ensuring that all power flowed directly from the emperor. He standardized weights and measures currency, and even the width of cart axles, so roads could be uniform and travel more efficient. Imagine the chaos before this: every region, with different money, different ways of measuring grain, different road ruts. It would be like trying to pay for your groceries in 3 different currencies while driving a car that only fits on certain roads. Qin Shi Huang's reforms, while often enforced with extreme severity, laid the administrative and economic groundwork for a truly unified nation, a foundation upon which future dynasties would build, perhaps less brutally, but certainly with his blueprint in mind. Having declared himself the Pakko, first emperor, Qin Shi Huang wasn't content to simply conquer. He set about meticulously and often brutally remaking China in his image. You can almost feel the restless energy radiating from this man, a relentless drive to consolidate power and leave an indelible mark on history. His vision was not just about establishing a dynasty, but about creating an entirely new imperial system, one that would theoretically last for 10,000 generations. Spoiler alert, it didn't quite make it that far, but he certainly aimed high. One of the most audacious and infamous aspects of his reign was his intellectual control. An authoritative historical fact is the burning of the books and burying of the scholars. In 213 BCE, fearing that dissenting intellectual traditions, particularly Confucianism, would undermine his absolute authority and the legalist system, Qin Shi Huang ordered the destruction of most historical records and philosophical texts not related to practical subjects like agriculture, medicine, or divination. Scholars who dared to defy him or even discuss the forbidden texts were reportedly executed, some by being buried alive. Imagine the sheer terror of witnessing such an act, the chilling silence that would descend upon intellectual discourse. This act, while deeply controversial then and now, was a testament to his desire for complete ideological uniformity, a sort of ancient thought police. For a quirky or off-topic fact, Qin Shi Huang was obsessed with immortality. He sent expeditions to search for legendary islands of immortals and elixirs of life, reportedly even consuming mercury and other harmful substances in his quest. It's quite ironic, isn't it? The man who built an empire to last forever inadvertently poisoned himself in his pursuit of eternal life. Perhaps he just hadn't heard of the eat your veggies and get some exercise school of thought. His paranoia about death only intensified as he aged, leading to secret tunnels and constantly shifting sleeping quarters to avoid assassins and evil spirits. Beyond the ideological suppression, the first emperor was a monumental builder. He initiated infrastructure projects on an unprecedented scale, largely through forced labor. The most famous, of course, was the connection and extension of existing defensive walls to form what would become the precursor to the Great Wall of China. Imagine millions of laborers, many of them conscripted peasants or condemned criminals, toiling in harsh conditions across rugged terrain, hauling stones and earth, all to create a barrier against northern nomadic incursions. It was a staggering feat of engineering and human endurance, a visible symbol of his power and his paranoia. Historians still debate whether the burning of the books was as complete and devastating as traditional accounts suggest, or if much of the knowledge survived in private collections and oral traditions. Was it a deliberate act of cultural annihilation or a more selective purge aimed at specific political opponents? The truth likely lies somewhere in the middle, but its symbolic impact remains undeniable, casting a long shadow over his legacy. He also constructed an elaborate network of roads and canals, further integrating his vast empire and facilitating rapid troop movements and trade. These were not just dirt tracks. They were often wide, carefully engineered arteries far superior to anything else in the world at the time. You could imagine imperial messengers galloping along these roads carrying decrees from the capital to the furthest reaches of the realm, cementing the central government's authority. But perhaps the most awe-inspiring of Qin Shi Huang's projects, and one that remains a testament to his ego and his belief in an afterlife, was his own mausoleum complex. Nestled near modern-day Xi'an, this isn't just a tomb. It's an entire underground city designed to mimic the imperial palace and the empire he ruled. And at its heart is arguably the most famous archaeological discovery in China, the Sais terracotta army. We're talking thousands of life-sized, individually sculpted clay soldiers, chariots, and horses arranged in battle formation, eternally guarding the emperor in his subterranean realm. It's a mind-boggling display of wealth, power, and meticulous planning, ensuring that even in death, the first emperor would maintain his vast dominion. It makes you wonder what kind of burial arrangements you'd make if you had unlimited resources and an unshakable belief in ruling the afterlife. You've probably seen pictures, perhaps even documentaries, but nothing quite prepares you for the sheer scale and silent grandeur of the Yinta terracotta army. Stepping into those excavation pits, even through the lens of a historical narrative, is like pulling back the curtain on a forgotten world perfectly preserved by the earth for over 2 millennia. This wasn't just a handful of statues. This was an entire subterranean legion created with an astonishing level of detail and artistry, serving as the eternal guard for Qin Shi Huang. Imagine the artisans, hundreds, perhaps thousands of them, toiling for years, possibly even decades, creating these figures. Each soldier is unique, with distinct facial features, hairstyles, and even expressions. You can almost feel the weight of their purpose, standing in unwavering formation, ready to defend their emperor, even beyond the grave. The archaeologists have unearthed not just infantrymen, but archers, cavalry charioteers, and even civilian officials, forming a comprehensive miniature replica of the Qin military and administration. It's like a macabre, life-sized action figure collection, but with a far more serious purpose than just playtime. An authoritative historical fact about the terracotta army is its unprecedented size and detail, with estimates suggesting over 8,000 soldiers, 130 chariots, and 520 horses. All life-sized and made of terracotta meticulously painted in vibrant colors, though much of the paint has faded over time. Each figure was assembled from pre-made components, but then individualized with unique features and expressions, a testament to an early form of mass production combined with custom craftsmanship. It's a level of artistic and organizational sophistication that still astounds modern observers. For a quirky or off-topic fact, the terracotta warriors were originally painted in vivid colors. Think bright reds, blues, greens, and yellows, which makes them even more astonishing. Imagine a whole army looking like they just stepped out of a highly saturated ancient Netflix series. Sadly, exposure to air after excavation often causes the paint to flake off rapidly. It's a race against time for conservationists, a battle against the elements more challenging than any skirmish the warriors themselves might have fought. The mausoleum complex itself, which remains largely unexcavated to protect its contents, is rumored to be even more spectacular. Ancient texts like the Records of the Grand Historian by Sima Qian describe a tomb filled with treasures, rivers of mercury, and constellations depicted on the ceiling. Historians still debate the literal accuracy of these descriptions, but ground-penetrating radar has confirmed high concentrations of mercury within the mound, suggesting at least some elements of the legend are true. It's a tantalizing mystery, a colossal archaeological puzzle waiting to be solved, but one that current technology isn't quite ready to tackle without risking irreparable damage. The scale of labor involved in these projects from the Great Wall to the mausoleum was staggering. Millions of peasants and forced laborers were conscripted, enduring harsh conditions, disease, and brutal discipline. You can feel the resentment brewing beneath the surface, a simmering discontent that would eventually boil over. The first emperor's relentless pursuit of standardization, his legalist policies, and his massive public works projects while creating a unified empire also created immense hardship and fostered deep animosity among the populace and the old aristocratic families he had so ruthlessly suppressed. His reign, though transformative, was remarkably short-lived. Qin Shi Huang died in 210 BCE reportedly, while on a journey searching for immortality, a cruel twist of fate for the man who desperately wanted to cheat death. His sudden demise triggered a power vacuum and a desperate attempt by his chief eunuch and prime minister to conceal his death and manipulate the succession. This led to intrigue, assassinations, and ultimately a rapid unraveling of the Qin Dynasty. The dynasty that was meant to last for 10,000 generations lasted for only 15 years after its unification. The sheer force of Qin Shi Huang's personality had held it together, but without his iron grip, the resentments he had bottled up exploded. Rebellions erupted across the empire, led by disgruntled peasants, former aristocrats, and ambitious warlords. You can envision the rapid descent into chaos, the sudden release of pent-up anger like a tightly wound spring finally snapping. The unification forged by such brutal efficiency ultimately collapsed under the weight of its own severity, paving the way for a new contender to pick up the pieces and perhaps learn a lesson or two from the Qin's dramatic rise and fall. The collapse of the Qin dynasty was swift and spectacular, a pyre of rebellion and resentment ignited by the death of its formidable, if terrifying, founder. You can imagine the widespread relief mixed with raw fear as the iron grip of Qin Shi Huang was finally loosened. The ensuing chaos was intense, a free-for-all as various rebel factions led by charismatic figures and disgruntled officials vied for supremacy. It was like a game of musical chairs, but the chairs were thrones, and the music was the clang of swords and the roar of angry mobs. Among the contenders who rose from the ashes of the Qin was a peasant from humble origins named Liu Bang. Unlike the aristocratic warlords or scholarly rebels, Liu Bang was a man of the people known for his easygoing nature, his ability to attract loyal followers, and a surprising degree of pragmatism. He wasn't a brilliant strategist in the mold of some of his rivals, but he was a master of human psychology, understanding what motivated people and how to win their allegiance. You can picture him perhaps a bit disheveled, inspiring his ragtag army with promises of a fairer, less oppressive rule. This is a crucial pivot point in Chinese history, moving from the autocratic Qin to a dynasty that would endure for centuries. His most formidable rival was Shang Yu, a powerful aristocratic general from the old state of Chu, a man of immense martial prowess and often described as a tragic hero. The struggle between Liu Bang and Xiang Yu, known as the Chu-Han contention, was an epic conflict full of dramatic battles, cunning betrayals, and legendary duels. It's the kind of story that would inspire countless plays and operas for generations to come, a real good versus evil, or at least resourceful underdog versus arrogant powerhouse showdown. Liu Bang, despite facing a more experienced and militarily superior adversary, ultimately triumphed through a combination of strategic retreats, clever alliances, and perhaps a touch of luck, ultimately cornering Xiang Yu and forcing his suicide. An authoritative historical fact is that Liu Bang formally established the Han Dynasty in 206 BCE, becoming Emperor Gaozu. He chose Chang'an near modern-day Xi'an as his capital, strategically located, and a symbolic break from the Qin's old power base. The Han Dynasty would go on to become one of the most enduring and influential dynasties in Chinese history, often regarded as a golden age that set the template for imperial rule for the next 2 millennia. The very name Han eventually became synonymous with the dominant ethnic group in China, the Han Chinese. For a quirky or off-topic fact, Emperor Gaozu, despite his imperial title, was reportedly quite fond of drinking and rather unrefined in his manners. He once famously relieved himself into the hat of a Confucian scholar to show his disdain for their elaborate rituals. It's a good reminder that even emperors had their quirks, and that perhaps not everyone was immediately thrilled with the idea of a peasant-turned-emperor. It certainly would have made for an awkward palace dinner party. Liu Bang, learning from the Qin's mistakes, adopted a more lenient and flexible approach to governance. While he maintained much of the Qin's centralized bureaucracy and standardized systems, roads, currency writing, he significantly reduced taxes and labor conscription, providing much-needed relief to the populace. He also initially granted large territories to his relatives and loyal generals, a partial reversion to the Zhou feudal system, though he quickly realized the dangers of such decentralization and began to consolidate power back to the central government. Historians still debate whether this initial decentralization was a genuine attempt at shared power or a temporary strategic concession to secure initial support. It's a complex question, balancing the desire for stability with the dangers of empowering rivals. Under the early Han emperors, particularly Emperor Wen and Emperor Jing, China experienced a period of remarkable recovery and prosperity. This was a time of internal peace, economic growth, and the restoration of intellectual life. The harsh legalist restrictions of the Qin were largely relaxed, and Confucianism, once suppressed, began to re-emerge as the dominant state ideology, albeit a Confucianism blended with elements of legalism and Daoism. This blend would become the enduring philosophical foundation of Imperial China, much like finding a recipe that perfectly combines sweet and savory, creating something entirely new and delicious. The early Han saw flourishing agriculture, a growing population, and the gradual re-establishment of a sophisticated administrative system. The shadow of the Qin's tyranny receded, replaced by a sense of stability and renewed purpose. This foundation would allow the Han to not only rebuild, but to expand their influence far beyond their borders, ushering in an era of unprecedented cultural and economic exchange that would literally put China on the world map. With stability returning under the Han Dynasty, you can almost feel the collective exhale of relief across China. The brutal efficiency of the Qin was replaced by a more nuanced Confucian-infused governance, and with peace came prosperity. This era saw a significant growth in agriculture driving up population numbers, and trade began to flourish both internally and externally. But it was the external expansion, particularly westward, that truly set the stage for one of history's most iconic trade routes. This route, a network of pathways rather than a single road, is famously known as the Silk Road. An authoritative historical fact is that the Silk Road was formally initiated and expanded under Emperor Wu of Han, reigned 141–87 BCE, often considered one of the greatest Han emperors. His decision to send envoys, most notably Zhang Qian, westward to establish alliances against the nomadic Xiongnu, a powerful confederation of steppe peoples to the north, inadvertently opened up direct trade routes with Central Asia, Persia, and eventually the Roman Empire. Imagine Zhang Qian, an intrepid explorer, venturing into unknown lands facing deserts, mountains, and hostile tribes, all in the name of diplomacy and a bit of geopolitical maneuvering. It's the ancient equivalent of a diplomatic mission to Mars, but with more camels and fewer oxygen tanks. The name Silk Road isn't just poetic, it's quite literal. Silk, a uniquely Chinese product whose manufacturing secrets were closely guarded, was the primary commodity that flowed westward. Imagine the awe and wonder of Roman patricians when they first saw this shimmering, delicate fabric so unlike anything produced in the West. It was exotic, luxurious, and immediately became a status symbol driving massive demand. But the Silk Road wasn't a one-way street. Gold, silver horses, glass wool, and various exotic goods flowed eastward into China. It was a bustling highway of cultural exchange, with religions like Buddhism, which would arrive centuries later via this route, and technologies hitching a ride alongside the caravans. For a quirky or off-topic fact, did you know that paper, another incredible Chinese invention, was already being developed and refined during the Han Dynasty? While not a primary trade item on the early Silk Road, its quiet evolution back in China was setting the stage for a revolution in communication and record-keeping that would eventually spread globally. Imagine a future where ancient Chinese scribes, instead of laboriously carving on bamboo or silk, could jot down their thoughts on a cheap, pliable sheet of paper. They'd probably think it was pure magic. The economic impact of the Silk Road was immense. It fostered the growth of merchant classes, led to the development of new cities along the trade routes, and significantly boosted the Han economy. The empire, having expanded its borders, now had a practical way to project its influence and acquire valuable resources. However, it also brought challenges, particularly the need to secure these long, vulnerable trade routes from bandits and nomadic raids, which required significant military investment and often led to further expansion. Historians still debate whether the primary motivation for opening the Silk Road was economic gain or strategic military alliances against the Xiongnu. Was it purely about trade, or was trade a convenient byproduct of a deeper geopolitical game? It's like asking if someone bought a new car because they needed it for work, or because they really wanted that heated steering wheel. The Han Dynasty under Emperor Wu reached its territorial zenith, stretching its influence deep into Central Asia, Korea, and Vietnam. This expansion was not without cost, draining the imperial coffers and requiring constant military vigilance. But it also brought diverse peoples and cultures into contact with the Han Empire, leading to a vibrant exchange that enriched Chinese society. You can almost feel the cultural dynamism of the capital Chang'an, a melting pot of peoples and ideas, where goods from distant lands filled the markets and foreign envoys mingled with Confucian scholars. This cosmopolitan atmosphere was a hallmark of the Han Golden Age, a testament to its confidence and expansive vision. The Han Dynasty, having soared to new heights of prosperity and influence under Emperor Wu, began to experience the inevitable pull of gravity that affects all empires. While the Silk Road brought untold riches and cultural exchange, maintaining such a vast network alongside territorial expansion and internal stability put immense strain on the imperial treasury. You can imagine the accountants in Chang'an, their abacuses clicking furiously, trying to balance the books, while the demands for military expeditions and grand projects kept piling up. It was a golden age, yes, but even gold can wear thin. As the 1st century BCE gave way to the 1st century CE, the Western Han, as this initial period is known, started to show signs of decline. Imperial authority weakened largely due to a succession of child emperors and the growing influence of powerful consort families and eunuchs within the court. These factions, constantly vying for power, created an atmosphere of intrigue and instability, undermining the very bureaucracy that the Han had worked so hard to establish. It's like a grand old house slowly rotting from the inside, even as its exterior still looks impressive. Amidst this growing unrest and dissatisfaction, a rather extraordinary figure emerged. Wang Mang. He was a nephew of the Empress Dowager Wang, a powerful figure in her own right. Wang Mang was known for his Confucian piety, his apparent humility, and his sharp intellect. He gradually accumulated power at court, presenting himself as a virtuous reformer concerned with the plight of the common people. You can picture him outwardly humble but, with an undeniable charisma, slowly but surely positioning himself as the savior of a troubled empire. An authoritative historical fact is that Wang Mang usurped the Han throne in 9 CE, declaring the establishment of his own Qin Dynasty, literally, New Dynasty. He claimed the mandate of heaven had passed to him due to the Han's decline and his own perceived virtue. This wasn't just a coup. It was an ideological statement, a bold attempt to justify a new order through a familiar philosophical framework. His reign was short-lived, lasting only 14 years, but it was remarkably disruptive and marked by ambitious, often disastrous reforms. For a quirky or off-topic fact, Wang Mang was apparently quite the inventor, or at least he encouraged innovation. During his reign, someone even developed a very early form of a public address system using speaking tubes to amplify sound over long distances. So while he was busy trying to reorganize the entire Chinese economy, someone else was figuring out how to make their voice heard across a crowded square. It just goes to show, even in times of political upheaval, human ingenuity finds a way. Wang Mang's reforms were radical and far-reaching, largely inspired by ancient Confucian and Zhou ideals, which he interpreted as a return to a more egalitarian, virtuous past. He nationalized land, redistributing it to peasants in an attempt to alleviate poverty and weaken the powerful landowning aristocracy. He abolished slavery, imposed new taxes on merchants, and even tried to standardize currency, introducing several new issues that often caused economic chaos due to their fluctuating value. Imagine trying to implement a universal basic income, land redistribution, and a currency overhaul all at once without modern communication or economic modeling. It was an ambitious blueprint for a utopian society, but in practice it often led to widespread confusion and resentment. Historians still debate whether Wang Mang was a true, well-intentioned reformer who was simply ahead of his time and overwhelmed by circumstances, or a power-hungry opportunist who used Confucian ideals as a smokescreen for his own ambition. Was he a visionary whose radical policies were just too much for a conservative society, or was he simply incompetent in their execution? It's a compelling question, as his reign truly was a roller coaster of well-meaning intentions and disastrous outcomes. The widespread discontent caused by his reforms, coupled with a series of devastating natural disasters, most notably the Yellow River changing its course, causing massive floods, and famine, created the perfect storm for rebellion. The mandate of heaven, which Wang Mang had so carefully claimed, seemed to be withdrawing just as quickly as it had been granted. Peasant uprisings, most famously the Red Eyebrows Rebellion, named for their painted eyebrows, a sign of defiance, erupted across the country. You can picture the desperation, the hunger, and the righteous fury that fueled these movements, culminating in a nationwide revolt that Wang Mang, despite his efforts, could not suppress. His utopian vision crumbled, paving the way for the surprising restoration of the very dynasty he had tried to replace. The dramatic collapse of Wang Mang's Qin Dynasty, hastened by his ambitious but ill-fated reforms and devastating natural disasters, left a power vacuum across China. The Red Eyebrows and other peasant rebellions had fractured the imperial authority, but they lacked the cohesive leadership to establish a new unified state. It was into this tumultuous landscape that a surprising restoration began to take shape, led by a descendant of the former Han imperial family, Liu Xuanfa, and more prominently, his cousin, Liu Shu-kus. You can imagine the scene: a desperate nation reeling from years of political instability, famine, and widespread conflict. People were yearning for the stability and prosperity that the Han Dynasty had represented, even if the Qin's brutal legacy still lingered in public memory. The return of a Han imperial descendant offered a glimmer of hope, a promise to restore a familiar and generally well-regarded order. Liu Shu, a diligent and charismatic leader, gradually distinguished himself from other claimants, demonstrating both military prowess and a statesmanlike demeanor. He was less of a brawler like Liu Bang and more of a strategic consolidator. An authoritative historical fact is that Liu Shu, after much struggle and consolidation of power, formally re-established the Han Dynasty in 25 CE, taking the title of Emperor Guangwu. This marked the beginning of the Yi Eastern Han Dynasty, also known as the Later Han, with its capital established at Luoyang, further to the east than the old Western Han capital of Chang'an. His reign was characterized by a period of remarkable recovery and consolidation, earning him a place among China's most effective emperors. It was a true phoenix from the ashes moment for the Han, proving the resilience of the imperial system and the enduring appeal of its institutions. For a quirky or off-topic fact, during the Eastern Han, a brilliant inventor named Zhang Heng developed an early seismograph, a device capable of detecting distant earthquakes. It was a large bronze vessel with dragons on the outside, each holding a ball in its mouth. When an earthquake struck, a ball would drop into the mouth of a toad below, indicating the direction of the tremor. So while emperors were busy rebuilding the empire, scientists were already trying to figure out how to give them an early warning system for seismic activity. Talk about being prepared for anything. Emperor Guangwu's reign was marked by a series of campaigns to suppress remaining rebel factions and consolidate his control over the vast empire. He carefully balanced centralized authority with pragmatic concessions, learning from the excesses of both the Qin and Wang Mang. He reintroduced and solidified the Confucian examination system for selecting officials, promoting meritocracy over aristocratic connections, a crucial step in strengthening the bureaucracy and ensuring a supply of talented administrators. This meant that theoretically, if you studied hard enough, you could rise in government service rather than just being born into it. It was like finally getting rid of the who you know system and bringing in the what you know system. Historians still debate the extent to which the Eastern Han successfully learned from the mistakes of the Western Han. Did they truly address the underlying issues of powerful consort families and eunuchs, or merely kick the can down the road, setting the stage for future problems? While there was an initial period of strong imperial control, these internal weaknesses would eventually re-emerge and plague the later Eastern Han. It's a bit like a renovated house that still has a few hidden structural weaknesses. They might not show up immediately, but given enough time, they'll become apparent. Under Guangwu and his successors, the Eastern Han enjoyed renewed prosperity. Agriculture flourished, trade routes like the Silk Road were re-secured and expanded, and cultural life thrived. Buddhism, though not yet widely adopted, began to trickle into China via the Silk Road, slowly planting its seeds among the existing Confucian and Daoist traditions. The empire's borders were largely stable, and the Xiongnu threat was for a time significantly reduced, sometimes even to the point of being subdued through a combination of military campaigns and diplomatic maneuvers. However, the seeds of eventual decline were also subtly being sown. The problem of powerful landowning families, often intertwined with the very officials chosen through the examination system, began to grow, concentrating wealth and influence, and sometimes challenging central authority. And the perennial issue of internal court politics, the struggles between imperial relatives, eunuchs, and scholarly officials, would once again escalate in the later centuries of the Eastern Han, gradually eroding the foundations that Emperor Guangwu had so carefully laid. It was a slow burn, not a sudden explosion, but the signs of future trouble were already there, like faint cracks appearing in a magnificent ancient vase. As the Eastern Han Dynasty settled into its long middle period, a sense of stability and prosperity largely prevailed. You could almost hear the collective sigh of relief as generations enjoyed relative peace, a stark contrast to the Warring States period, or the Qin's brutal efficiency. But even in times of calm, undercurrents of trouble were brewing slowly, but surely eroding the imperial foundations. It was like a magnificent ship seemingly sailing smoothly, but with tiny leaks quietly springing up below the waterline unnoticed until it was almost too late. The root of many problems lay in the very structure of the court itself. The growing power of Saisad consort families, relatives of the empresses and eunuchs, became a persistent issue. With many Han emperors ascending the throne as children, power naturally gravitated towards their mothers' families, or the eunuchs who had direct access to the emperor and controlled the palace bureaucracy. Imagine a constant low-level turf war within the Forbidden City, where personal influence and backroom deals often superseded official merit or the good of the empire. This created factions, intrigue, and a drain on resources as positions were bought and sold, and corruption became rampant. An authoritative historical fact is that the later Eastern Han court was repeatedly plagued by violent clashes between rival factions of eunuchs and scholarly officials often aligned with various consort families. These struggles sometimes erupted into open conflict, leading to purges, assassinations, and a constant weakening of the central government's ability to govern effectively. The partisan prohibitions of the 160s and 170s CE, for example, saw thousands of scholars and officials unjustly imprisoned or executed by eunuchs, further alienating the educated elite. For a quirky or off-topic fact, during the Eastern Han period, a popular indoor game resembling modern-day football or soccer called kuju was widely played even by emperors. So while the palace was consumed by political machinations outside, people were probably kicking around a leather ball, completely unaware of the looming imperial collapse. It's a reminder that daily life, with its simple pleasures, often continues oblivious to the grand historical dramas unfolding in the corridors of power. Adding to the internal strife was the escalating problem of powerful landowning families. Many officials, once they gained wealth and influence, invested heavily in land, building up vast estates and private armies. These families often exempted themselves from taxes, leaving the burden on the common peasants, and asserted increasing control over their local regions. This led to a significant decrease in imperial revenue and a corresponding rise in rural poverty and social inequality. Historians still debate whether the collapse of the Eastern Han was primarily due to internal court intrigue, the rise of regional warlords, or the widespread economic discontent of the peasantry. It's likely a toxic cocktail of all three, wouldn't you agree? Wouldn't you? The growing social and economic disparities fueled widespread peasant discontent. Taxes where heavy natural disasters like floods and droughts seemed to become more frequent, and the central government, weakened by internal squabbles, was increasingly unable to provide relief or maintain order. This simmering resentment eventually erupted into open rebellion. The most significant of these was the Yellow Turban Rebellion, which broke out in 184 CE. Led by Taoist healers who promised a utopian society and wore yellow headbands, this massive uprising swept across much of China. You can imagine the sheer scale of the rebellion: millions of desperate peasants driven by hunger and a yearning for change rising up against the corrupt and seemingly uncaring Han establishment. While the Yellow Turbans were eventually suppressed by regional generals often allied with powerful local landowners, the rebellion irrevocably shattered the last vestiges of central Han authority. The empire was left fractured and exhausted, with these very generals who had suppressed the rebellion now holding immense independent power. They were no longer loyal servants of the throne, but emerging warlords, carving out their own spheres of influence. The mandate of heaven was clearly wavering, and the long, glorious Han Dynasty was rapidly spiraling into a period of extreme disunion and conflict, laying the groundwork for the legendary Three Kingdoms period. The Yellow Turban Rebellion, though ultimately crushed, was the final devastating blow to the already tottering Eastern Han Dynasty. You can envision the landscape of China at the close of the 2nd century CE, a patchwork of territories controlled by powerful self-serving warlords, each commanding their own armies and paying only lip service to the increasingly powerless Han Emperor in Luoyang. It was less of an empire and more of a really, really large fractured jigsaw puzzle, with pieces constantly shifting and trying to swallow each other. This chaotic yet militarily fascinating period is famously known as the Three Kingdoms, lasting roughly from 220 CE to 280 CE. This era has become legendary in Chinese culture, immortalized in literature like the 14th century novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms, a sprawling epic that has captivated audiences for centuries. It's like a historical reality show, but with more betrayal, epic battles, and philosophical debate. The three main contenders who would eventually carve China into their respective realms were the states of Hou, Wei Shu Han, and Wu Hao. First, there was Cao Cao, a brilliant strategist, poet, and politician who through cunning and military genius consolidated control over the north, establishing the foundation for the state of Wei. He was a complex figure often portrayed as a ruthless villain in later popular culture, but in reality, he was a pragmatic and highly effective leader who understood the art of power. Imagine him a figure of intellectual prowess and military might, navigating a treacherous political landscape always one step ahead of his rivals. He famously stated, "I would rather betray the world than let the world betray me." It pretty much sums up his approach to diplomacy. Then there was Liu Bei, a distant relative of the Han imperial family who gathered a loyal following based on his benevolence and reputation for treating his subordinates with respect. He and his sworn brothers, the fearsome warrior Guan Yu and the boisterous Zhang Fei, embody the ideals of loyalty and brotherhood that are so central to the romance of the Three Kingdoms. His state, Shu Han Hu, was established in the southwest, centered around modern-day Sichuan. You can picture Liu Bei, noble and persistent, continually trying to restore the Han, or at least his version of it, against overwhelming odds. Finally, in the fertile lands of the Yangtze River Delta emerged Sun Quan, who established the state of Wu. He inherited a stable power base from his elder brother and father, and proved to be a shrewd and capable ruler, building a formidable navy and controlling the strategic waterways of the south. Wu was known for its strong defensive position and its burgeoning maritime trade. So you have the disciplined pragmatic North Wei, the noble struggling southwest Shu Han, and the strategic waterbound southeast Wu. It's like three very different personalities trying to share one very large, valuable toy. An authoritative historical fact is that the decisive Battle of Red Cliffs in 208 CE, where the allied forces of Liu Bei and Sun Quan decisively defeated Cao Cao's much larger northern fleet, prevented Cao Cao from unifying China under his sole rule and set the stage for the long period of the three distinct states. Imagine the sheer audacity of this victory, a classic underdog tale, where clever tactics and environmental factors like disease and wind trumped numerical superiority. It was a pivotal moment cementing the division for decades to come. For a quirky or off-topic fact, the invention of the Sao wheelbarrow is often attributed to a Shu Han chancellor, Zhuge Liang, during this period. He supposedly created it to transport military supplies more efficiently over rugged terrain. So while these legendary generals were busy fighting epic battles, someone was quietly inventing a game-changing piece of logistics equipment that would benefit countless generations of laborers. Talk about multitasking. The Three Kingdoms period was a time of almost constant warfare, but also of incredible ingenuity and strategic brilliance. Military tactics evolved rapidly, with elaborate sieges, naval battles, and psychological warfare becoming common. It was also a period of significant technological advancements, not just the wheelbarrow but also improvements in metallurgy, agriculture, and cartography. Despite the pervasive conflict, society continued to function, albeit often under duress. Historians still debate which of the three kingdoms, had they made different strategic choices, might have ultimately unified China sooner. Was it Wei's overwhelming power, Shu Han's moral legitimacy, or Wu's strategic defensibility that held the most promise for lasting dominion? It's a compelling what-if scenario that fuels endless discussions among enthusiasts. Ultimately, the Three Kingdoms period would not last indefinitely. The constant conflict was unsustainable, and even the greatest generals eventually aged or succumbed to their rivals. The stage was being set for another, albeit short-lived, attempt at reunification, reminding us that even the most dramatic sagas eventually give way to new chapters. The vibrant, albeit bloody tapestry of the Three Kingdoms period eventually began to unravel, not with a bang, but with a series of political maneuvers and internal power shifts. You can almost feel the weariness settling over the land after decades of relentless conflict, a collective yearning for a return to a unified, peaceful China. While the great generals and strategists of Wei, Shu Han, and Wu had battled to a stalemate, new players, often from within their own ranks, were quietly ascending. The state of Wei, having inherited the most populous and agriculturally rich northern plains, always held the geographical and demographic advantage. However, within Wei, power was gradually being usurped by the Arisima family. They were an influential aristocratic clan, serving as high-ranking officials and generals, much like the powerful families that plagued the later Han. Sima Yi, a cunning and patient strategist, had been a key figure under Cao Cao, and his successors gradually accumulating power and prestige. Imagine him a quiet force in the background, subtly pulling strings and outmaneuvering his rivals, much like a chess grandmaster setting up a devastating endgame. An authoritative historical fact is that the Sima family effectively ended the Wei dynasty by formally deposing its emperor in 265 CE, with Sima Yan establishing the Qin Dynasty and proclaiming himself Emperor Wu of Jin. This wasn't a military conquest in the traditional sense, but rather a carefully orchestrated coup where the mandate of heaven was transferred through a puppet emperor. It was a neat trick, essentially legitimizing a change of power without the full-scale devastation of open war, at least initially. For a quirky or off-topic fact during this period of transition, Chinese calligraphy was evolving into a highly respected art form. Figures like Wang Shiji, often called the Sage of Calligraphy, lived during the Qin Dynasty, and his elegant, fluid brush strokes would influence generations. So while political power was shifting hands, artists were quietly perfecting an aesthetic that would become synonymous with Chinese culture. It's a good reminder that beauty can flourish even amidst turmoil. The Qin dynasty under Sima Yan then set about completing the long-awaited reunification. His primary target was the state of Wu in the south, which had resisted northern dominance for decades thanks to its strong navy and defensive waterways. In 280 CE, the Jin launched a massive campaign overwhelming Wu's defenses and finally bringing the entire Chinese heartland under a single rule for the first time in nearly a century. You can picture the jubilation in the Jin capital, the sense of accomplishment that the long nightmare of division was finally over. However, this newfound unity was tragically short-lived, much like a fleeting summer thunderstorm. The Jin dynasty, known as the Western Jin, at this point faced significant internal weaknesses that would quickly unravel its fragile grasp on power. One major issue was the nature of its founding rather than being forged in the crucible of unification, like the Qin or Han. The Jin had risen through internal manipulation. The Sima emperors, perhaps wary of powerful generals, granted extensive land and military command to their own relatives, creating a network of semi-independent princes. This was a disastrous reversion to the old Zhou feudal model, almost guaranteeing future conflict. Historians still debate whether the Jin's swift collapse was primarily due to its inherent internal weaknesses, its over-reliance on a flawed decentralized system, or the external pressure from northern nomadic groups. It's a bit like a house built on shaky foundations. It might stand for a bit, but any strong wind will bring it down. And the strong winds were coming. The northern borders of China had long been home to various nomadic and semi-nomadic tribes, often referred to collectively as the Five Barbarians. These groups, accustomed to raiding and migrating, had grown in strength and numbers, partly due to the prolonged internal strife within China. Many had been settled within or near Chinese borders, as auxiliaries or tenants, and as the central Jin government weakened, their ambitions grew. You can imagine the chilling stories filtering back from the frontier tales of encroaching tribes and dwindling imperial patrols. The Jin court, plagued by infighting and a succession of weak or ineffective emperors, was ill-equipped to handle this external threat. The War of the Eight Princes. A brutal internecine struggle among the Jin imperial princes from 291 to 306 CE utterly devastated the central government and left the northern heartland vulnerable. It was a self-inflicted wound, opening the gates for the very invaders they should have been defending against. The fragile unity shattered, leading directly to one of the most prolonged and significant periods of disunion in Chinese history. The self-inflicted wounds of the War of the Eight Princes had left the Qin dynasty bleeding, a weakened prey in a landscape teeming with predators. You can almost hear the triumphant shouts of the northern nomadic tribes who had long cast their eyes southward, recognizing the opportune moment to strike. This marked the end of the unified Western Jin and plunged China into one of its most turbulent and enduring periods of fragmentation, the Northern and Southern Dynasties period, lasting from 304 CE to 589 CE. It was nearly 3 centuries of division, a testament to how profoundly fractured the empire had become. Imagine the dramatic shift. As the Jin court crumbled, many of the non-Chinese nomadic groups, whom the Chinese had historically referred to as the Five Barbarians, a rather uncharitable but common term for various nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples like the Xiongnu, Xianbei, Qiangjie, and Di, surged southward. These groups, who had often served as auxiliary troops or lived along the frontiers, now established their own kingdoms in the north. This was not a single unified invasion, but a wave of separate incursions and state-building efforts, leading to a dizzying succession of short-lived dynasties in the north. It's like a historical game of musical chairs, but the chairs kept getting knocked over and new players constantly joined in. An authoritative historical fact about this period is the Haum Yongjia catastrophe of 311 CINET, when the Xiongnu sacked and destroyed the Jin capital of Luoyang. This event forced the remnants of the Jin imperial court and many Han Chinese aristocrats to flee south across the Yangtze River, establishing a new capital at Jiankang, modern-day Nanjing. This marked the definitive split between the northern and southern halves of China, creating two distinct political and cultural spheres for centuries to come. For a quirky or off-topic fact during this chaotic period, the popularity of Buddhism exploded in China. Its message of suffering, impermanence, and compassion resonated deeply with a population enduring constant warfare and instability. Monasteries became centers of learning and refuge, attracting many followers, even among the ruling elites of both the north and south. So while armies clashed and dynasties rose and fell, a new foreign religion was quietly taking root, changing the spiritual landscape of China forever. It's almost as if people needed a little extra comfort in such trying times. In the south, the relocated Jin court established the Eastern Qin Dynasty, 317–420 CE. Here, the Han Chinese aristocracy largely maintained traditional Chinese culture, arts, and political systems, albeit in a more fragmented and often less powerful form. They saw themselves as the true inheritors of the Han legacy, preserving classical traditions against the perceived barbarization of the North. You can picture them, these refined Southern gentlemen, debating philosophy and poetry, perhaps, with a sense of melancholic pride that they were keeping the flame of Han civilization alive, even as the North descended into what they viewed as barbarism. Meanwhile, the North was a melting pot of cultures. The five barbarians established numerous short-lived kingdoms, often adopting Chinese administrative practices and even intermarrying with the local Han population. This led to a fascinating process of Sinicization, where these non-Chinese rulers and their peoples gradually adopted Chinese language, customs, and political structures. This wasn't always a smooth process. There were periods of intense conflict, ethnic tension, and forced assimilation. Historians still debate the extent to which this Sinicization was a voluntary adoption of superior culture by the nomadic peoples or a forced assimilation driven by the sheer numerical superiority of the Han Chinese. It's a complex interplay of power dynamics, cultural exchange, and adaptation. Despite the political fragmentation, both North and South experienced periods of significant cultural and technological development. In the North, military innovations were constant as different nomadic groups refined their tactics and integrated cavalry more effectively. In the South, arts, literature, and philosophy, particularly Daoism and the newly arrived Buddhism, flourished. Scholars and artists often sought refuge in the relative safety of the southern courts, leading to a blossoming of intellectual and creative endeavors. This long period of disunion, while brutal, ironically led to a greater diversity of cultural expression and the eventual deeper integration of diverse peoples into the broader Chinese identity. It was a chaotic crucible that in time would forge a stronger, more culturally resilient China. For nearly 3 centuries, China remained fractured, a landscape of competing kingdoms and shifting allegiances, a testament to the Qin Dynasty's epic fail. You could picture the average peasant during this time, probably less concerned with who was on the throne and more worried about who was going to tax their crops this season, or if their village would be overrun by the latest invading army. But even the longest periods of disunity eventually give way to the yearning for a grand, unified empire. And so, from the chaos of the northern and southern dynasties, a new power began to coalesce, promising to once again bring all under heaven under a single rule, the Qing Dynasty. This reunification, though brief, was monumental. It was spearheaded by a northern general named Yang Jian, who served the northern Zhou dynasty, one of the many short-lived states in the north. Yang Jian was a shrewd and ambitious man, much like the Qin Shi Huang of old, but perhaps with a slightly less mercury-filled diet. He belonged to a powerful aristocratic family that had intermarried with Xianbei, a nomadic group elites embodying the cultural fusion that had taken place in the north. An authoritative historical fact is that Yang Jian usurped the northern Zhou throne in 581 CE, establishing the Qin Dynasty and proclaiming himself Emperor Wen. He then systematically launched campaigns to conquer the remaining southern dynasties, finally reunifying China in 589 CE by defeating the Qin Dynasty. This was a massive undertaking requiring vast naval forces and coordinated land armies, a testament to his military and organizational prowess. It brought an end to 273 years of continuous division, a truly significant moment in Chinese history. For a quirky or off-topic fact, Emperor Wen, despite his ruthlessness in conquering, was known for his personal frugality and disdain for luxury. He supposedly wore simple clothes and ate plain food, and even lectured his officials on the dangers of extravagance. Imagine being a high-ranking official trying to impress the emperor with a lavish feast only to be chastised for wasting resources. It's a bit like trying to show off your new sports car to a minimalist. Emperor Wen immediately set about consolidating his power and rebuilding the administrative apparatus of the empire, drawing heavily on the precedents of the Han and Qin. He restructured the government, re-established a rigorous civil service examination system, though it was still early in its development, and streamlined the tax system. His goal was to create a strong, centralized state, wiping away the regionalism and factionalism that had plagued the previous centuries. He also revived and standardized the land distribution system, ensuring that peasants had plots to farm and that the government had a reliable tax base. This was a crucial step in bringing order and prosperity back to the countryside. Historians still debate whether the Qin dynasty's swift rise and fall were primarily due to the unsustainable scale of its grand projects or the inherent brutality of its rulers, particularly Emperor Yang. Was it simply too much too fast, or were the emperors fundamentally flawed in their governance? It's a question that echoes through the annals of empires. But it was Emperor Wen's successor, his ambitious and controversial son, Emperor Yang Zhou, reigned 604 since 618 CE, who truly embarked on the most monumental and often devastating infrastructure projects. Emperor Yang was a man of immense vision, but also of incredible extravagance and ruthless ambition. He seemed determined to outdo every previous emperor in terms of scale and grandeur. He continued his father's policies, but magnified them tenfold, pushing the empire to its breaking point. His projects included extensive renovations and extensions of the Great Wall, which again required immense human labor and caused widespread suffering. He also ordered the construction of a magnificent new capital at Luoyang, a testament to imperial splendor, but also a drain on resources. But the most famous and perhaps infamous of his undertakings was the construction of the Grand Canal. This wasn't just a ditch. It was a vast network of waterways connecting the Yellow River in the north with the Yangtze River in the south, designed to facilitate the transport of grain and troops across the immense unified empire. It was an astonishing feat of engineering, but built at an almost unimaginable human cost. You can almost hear the groans of the millions of conscripted laborers driven to exhaustion as they dug and hauled under the watchful eyes of imperial overseers. This massive watery artery would forever change the geography and economy of China, even as it contributed to the downfall of the very dynasty that created it. The relentless, almost manic drive of Emperor Yang of Sui to complete his monumental projects quickly overshadowed the initial period of stability brought by his father, Emperor Wen. You can almost feel the ground shaking under the immense weight of these endeavors. The air thick with the dust of construction and the silent cries of countless laborers. While the Grand Canal project in particular was an engineering marvel that would benefit future generations, its immediate cost was devastating both in human lives and imperial resources. Imagine millions of men and women conscripted from every corner of the empire, forced to dig dredge and haul in unimaginable conditions. Many perished from exhaustion, disease, and starvation. This wasn't just a national project. It was a human meat grinder sacrificing countless lives for imperial ambition. The sheer scale was mind-boggling, a network of canals stretching for over 1,776 kilometers, about 100 miles, connecting the major rivers, and ultimately linking the prosperous south with the political and military centers of the north. It's like digging a cross-country trench using only shovels and sheer manpower. An authoritative historical fact is that the Grand Canal, constructed during the Sui dynasty, served as a vital artery for transporting grain from the fertile Yangtze River Delta to the northern capitals and military garrisons, as well as facilitating troop movements. This significantly improved the logistical capabilities of the empire and helped to integrate the diverse regions of China economically and politically, a benefit that would be fully realized by later dynasties. Without it, unifying and maintaining a vast empire like China would have been exponentially more difficult. For a quirky or off-topic fact, Emperor Yang was reportedly so enamored with his new canal that he famously commissioned a vast, elaborate fleet of dragon boats, complete with floating palaces, and a retinue of concubines and entertainers to tour its length. While millions of his subjects suffered from famine and forced labor, he was essentially throwing the world's most opulent and tone-deaf boat party. It's a good example of imperial disconnect, proving that even in ancient times, leaders could be completely out of touch with the struggles of their people. The Grand Canal, while a testament to Sui ambition, became a symbol of the dynasty's overreach. It allowed for rapid transport of troops and goods, but it required immense upkeep, and its construction alienated vast swathes of the population. Coupled with his other extravagant projects like the rebuilding of the Great Wall and the construction of opulent palaces, it drained the imperial treasury dry. You can practically hear the groans of the tax collectors trying to squeeze more out of an already depleted peasantry. Historians still debate whether Emperor Yang's megalomania was a fatal flaw that doomed the Sui, or if his ambitious projects, despite their human cost, laid the indispensable groundwork for the subsequent Tang dynasty's golden age. Was he a visionary whose methods were simply too harsh, or a reckless tyrant who deserved his fate? It's a complex question weighing the long-term benefits against the immediate suffering. Emperor Yang's ambition wasn't limited to internal projects. He also launched a series of disastrous and incredibly costly military campaigns, particularly against the Korean kingdom of Goguryeo. These campaigns, fought far from the Chinese heartland, resulted in catastrophic losses of life and resources, further exacerbating the empire's financial woes and popular discontent. Imagine sending hundreds of thousands of men into bitter, unforgiving winters only for them to be decimated by enemy resistance and logistical nightmares. The widespread discontent finally boiled over into widespread rebellion. Peasant uprisings led by various opportunistic figures erupted across the empire, fueled by hunger, exhaustion, and a deep-seated resentment against the emperor's excesses. Local magnates and disaffected officials also joined the fray, sensing the emperor's vulnerability. The carefully constructed imperial edifice built with such immense effort began to crack and splinter under the weight of its own hubris. Emperor Yang, by now deeply unpopular and increasingly detached from reality, retreated to the south. In 618 CE, he was assassinated by one of his own generals, marking the ignominious end of the Sui dynasty, which had lasted for a mere 37 years. Its short reign, however, had left an indelible mark. It had reunited China after centuries of division, implemented crucial administrative reforms, and most notably, built the Grand Canal. These foundations, albeit laid with blood and tears, would prove invaluable to the dynasty that would rise from its ashes, poised to usher in one of China's most glorious eras. The swift and brutal collapse of the Sui dynasty left China reeling, but not for long. From the ashes of Emperor Yang's megalomania and the chaos of widespread rebellions, a new, more enduring power was already emerging. You can almost feel the collective sigh of relief as the oppressive weight of forced labor and endless wars lifted, replaced by the promise of a more stable and prosperous future. This new dawn was ushered in by the Tang Dynasty, which would go on to be regarded as one of China's most glorious and influential periods. The founder of the Tang Dynasty was Li Yuan, a prominent aristocratic general who had served the Sui. He was a cousin of Emperor Yang, and initially he had little desire to rebel. However, as the Sui fragmented and rebellions spread, Li Yuan saw his opportunity, perhaps even his necessity. With the support of his capable son Li Shimin, who would become one of China's most revered emperors, he raised an army and marched on the Sui capital of Chang'an. Imagine the careful calculations, the whispered conspiracies, and the decisive moments when a general decides to stake everything on a rebellion. An authoritative historical fact is that Li Yuan formally established the Tang Dynasty in 618 CE. Taking the imperial title of Emperor Gaozu, he quickly secured control over the remaining Sui territories and suppressed various rival warlords, effectively unifying China once again. His reign, though important, was relatively brief, as he wisely recognized the immense talents and popularity of his son Li Shimin. For a quirky or off-topic fact, the Tang Dynasty was a period where horses were incredibly important, not just for warfare and transport, but also for polo. The Tang court was obsessed with polo, and emperors themselves would often play. So while future generations might celebrate their cultural achievements, imagine these powerful figures in their elaborate robes galloping across a field trying to whack a ball. It's a reminder that even the most serious historical figures had their leisure activities. Li Shimin, later known as Emperor Taizong, ascended the throne in 626 CE after a dramatic incident, the Xuanwu Gate incident, where he eliminated his brothers who were rivals for the succession. His reign, 626-649 CE, is widely considered the true beginning of the Tang's golden age. He was a brilliant military strategist, an astute administrator, and a patron of the arts and scholarship. You can picture him a dynamic and charismatic leader, inspiring loyalty and fear in equal measure, setting the tone for centuries of imperial grandeur. Under Emperor Taizong, the Tang Empire expanded its borders, significantly pushing into Central Asia, Tibet, and Korea. The Silk Road, which had faltered during the period of disunion, was fully revived and flourished as never before, leading to an unprecedented exchange of goods, ideas, and cultures. Chang'an, the Tang capital and the same city as the Western Han capital, but much expanded, became the largest and most cosmopolitan city in the world, a true melting pot of peoples, religions, and fashions. Imagine walking through its bustling markets, hearing a dozen different languages, seeing merchants from Persia and India, and smelling spices from far-off lands. The Tang Dynasty adopted many of the Sui's administrative reforms, particularly the Grand Canal and the civil service examination system, but refined them and made them more effective. The examination system, open to all in theory who could demonstrate talent and knowledge of the Confucian classics, became the primary route to officialdom. This created a highly meritocratic bureaucracy that drew talent from across the empire, ensuring competent governance for much of the dynasty's early period. Historians still debate whether the Tang's early success was primarily due to its strong military, its excellent administrative system, or the sheer talent of its early emperors. It's a compelling blend of factors, all contributing to a period of remarkable achievement. The Tang was not just about military might and efficient administration, it was a cultural powerhouse. Poetry reached an unparalleled peak with masters like Li Bai and Du Fu, creating timeless works that captured the spirit of the age. Buddhism, having steadily grown during the period of disunion, gained widespread popularity, becoming a major force in Chinese religious life, often existing alongside Confucianism and Daoism. Art, music, and technological innovations also flourished, making the early and middle Tang a truly vibrant and dynamic era. It was a time when China was arguably the most advanced and culturally rich civilization in the world, radiating confidence and influence far beyond its borders. The dust settled. The last cries of resistance faded, and the might of Kublai Khan had finally brought all of China under Mongol rule, establishing the Yuan Dynasty. You could almost feel the weight of this new foreign dominion settling over the ancient land, a subtle but pervasive shift in the very air. But this wasn't just about China. It was about China as part of something much, much bigger, the vast, sprawling Mongol Empire, a territory so immense it dwarfed any previous land empire. This period, particularly in the mid-13th to mid-14th centuries, became known as the Pax Mongolica, or Mongol Peace. Imagine for a moment being a merchant in Yuan, China. The previous centuries had been a chaotic patchwork of warring states and fragmented power. Now, from Beijing to Baghdad, from the frozen steppes to the sunny Mediterranean, you could theoretically travel with a degree of safety unprecedented in human history. The Mongol conquests, though brutal in their execution, paradoxically created a vast zone of stability across Eurasia. It was like finally getting everyone on the same Wi-Fi network after years of patchy, unreliable connections. An authoritative historical fact is that the Pax Mongolica greatly facilitated and reinvigorated trade along the Silk Road, leading to an unprecedented flow of goods, technologies, and ideas between East and West. With Mongol control extending from the Pacific to Eastern Europe, merchants and travelers enjoyed a relative security previously unimaginable. They no longer had to navigate a dozen different customs barriers or constantly worry about rival warlords. This single vast imperial system provided a kind of common market for a huge chunk of the known world. You might see caravans laden with Chinese silk porcelain and gunpowder, yes, that stuff again, heading westward, while spices from India, precious stones from Persia, and even medicines and scientific texts from the Middle East flowed eastward. It wasn't just about goods, it was about knowledge. Chinese innovations like printing the compass and various agricultural techniques made their way to Europe, while Persian astronomy and Arabic medicine arrived in China. It was a true global village centuries before the internet. For a quirky or off-topic fact, the Mongols were incredibly efficient at maintaining their vast postal relay system known as the Yamphon. It involved a network of post stations with fresh horses and provisions at regular intervals, allowing messages and important people to travel at incredible speeds across the empire. It was essentially the world's first high-speed mail delivery service, making FedEx look sluggish. Imagine a Mongol courier galloping across the plains, probably muttering about missed delivery windows if they were running behind schedule. However, for the Han Chinese, the Pax Mongolica was a double-edged sword. While trade flourished and some intellectuals found patronage, the experience of foreign rule was often deeply resented. The Mongols implemented a rigid social hierarchy with themselves at the top, followed by various non-Han groups like Central Asians and Uyghurs, who served as administrators, and then the Han Chinese, especially Southerners, at the bottom. This effectively marginalized the traditional Confucian scholar gentry class who found themselves displaced by foreigners in positions of power. It was like suddenly finding out your entire career path was obsolete because the new management preferred people from a different background. Historians still debate whether the Pax Mongolica truly benefited China in the long run, or if its positive aspects were overshadowed by the harshness of foreign rule and social stratification. Was the increased trade worth the loss of cultural autonomy and the perceived humiliation of being governed by barbarians? It's a complex question often colored by national narratives and historical grievances. The Mongols also implemented policies that were designed to benefit their own people and allies rather than necessarily the Han Chinese. They imposed heavy taxes often collected by non-Han officials, which further alienated the local population. While they maintained aspects of Chinese administration, they also brought their own nomadic customs and laws, which sometimes clashed with traditional Chinese ways. You could almost feel the cultural dissonance, the subtle tension between the conquerors and the conquered simmering beneath the surface of apparent peace. Despite the resentment, the Yuan dynasty's integration into the larger Mongol Empire brought a cosmopolitan flavor to China unseen before. Foreigners flocked to the capital of Dadu, modern-day Beijing, bringing new perspectives and technologies. Kublai Khan himself, while maintaining his Mongol identity, also adopted many Chinese imperial rituals and patronized Chinese arts, recognizing the need to govern a sophisticated civilization. Yet the underlying truth remained. This was a conquest dynasty, and the Han Chinese, for the first time in centuries, were ruled by outsiders from the steppe. This foreign rule, while bringing certain benefits, also planted the seeds of the next great rebellion, a yearning for the return of native rule that would eventually lead to the Yuan's downfall. The Pax Mongolica, while creating a vast and relatively secure trade zone across Eurasia, also brought new faces to China, among them the most famous Western visitor of the medieval era, Marco Polo. You can almost picture him, a young Venetian merchant, wide-eyed and adventurous, stepping into the bustling cosmopolitan streets of Konbalik, modern-day Beijing, the Yuan capital, a city grander than anything he had ever seen in Europe. His journey and his subsequent accounts would open the eyes of Europeans to the wonders of the East, forever altering their understanding of the world. An authoritative historical fact is that Marco Polo traveled extensively in the Yuan Empire from roughly 1275 to 1292 CE, serving for a time in the court of Kublai Khan. His travels, meticulously documented in his book, The Travels of Marco Polo, or Il Milione, provided Europeans with an unprecedented and detailed account of China's immense wealth, advanced civilization, and unique customs. Before Polo, European knowledge of the Far East was largely based on vague rumors and fantastical tales. Imagine his astonishment as he encountered innovations that were still centuries away from reaching Europe. He would have seen paper money in widespread circulation, a concept utterly foreign to a European still accustomed to bartering or using precious metals. He probably marveled at the efficient postal system we talked about far superior to anything in the West. He would have witnessed Chinese printing gunpowder being used for fireworks and early weaponry, and the sophisticated engineering of canals and bridges. It must have felt like stepping into a futuristic wonderland. For a quirky or off-topic fact, it's believed that Marco Polo might have introduced Italian pasta to China, or at least he saw noodles there, and brought back the concept leading to the development of pasta as we know it in Italy. Or perhaps, and this is more likely, the Chinese already had noodles and he just enjoyed them immensely and helped spread the word. Either way, next time you're enjoying a bowl of spaghetti, you can thank, or perhaps blame, an ancient cultural exchange facilitated by the Mongols. It just goes to show sometimes the most profound historical impacts come in the form of a good meal. Marco Polo's descriptions of Kublai Khan's court were equally captivating. He depicted a lavish, organized, and powerful empire far more sophisticated than European kingdoms. He spoke of Khanbalik's immense size, its well-ordered markets, and the Khan's grand palaces. He also recounted tales of vast riches, countless subjects, and the Khan's immense power, painting a picture of an empire that dwarfed anything in the West. His book, though sometimes embellished for dramatic effect, historians still debate the accuracy of every detail, particularly regarding his specific roles in Kublai's court, inspired countless explorers and merchants, fueling the nascent European desire to reach the fabled lands of the East. However, the Yuan dynasty, for all its grandiosity and connection to the wider world, faced significant internal challenges. The very foreignness that made it exotic to Marco Polo was a source of deep resentment for the Han Chinese population. The discriminatory social hierarchy, the heavy taxes levied to fund ambitious projects and lavish court expenses, and the economic instability caused by excessive printing of paper money all contributed to growing discontent. You could sense the simmering unrest, a subtle undercurrent of defiance beneath the surface of Mongol rule. Historians still debate the precise impact of Marco Polo's accounts on European exploration. Did his book directly inspire Columbus and other navigators to seek new routes to the east? Or was it merely one piece of a larger puzzle of growing European curiosity and ambition? It's a compelling question given the profound impact his travels had on the European imagination. As the 14th century wore on, the Yuan dynasty began to show signs of decline, mirroring the classic dynastic cycle. A succession of weak and short-lived emperors, coupled with corruption and internal power struggles among the Mongol elite, further weakened central authority. Natural disasters, including devastating floods and droughts, exacerbated the suffering of the peasantry and were interpreted by many as signs that the Mongols had lost the mandate of heaven. You could imagine the whispers in the villages, the growing belief that the foreign rulers had forfeited their right to govern. This growing instability, coupled with economic hardship and widespread resentment, set the stage for a series of peasant rebellions culminating in a powerful movement that would eventually drive the Mongols back to the steppes and usher in another era of native Chinese rule. The stage was being set for the grand comeback. The Yuan dynasty, for all its grand imperial connections and cosmopolitan flair, was crumbling from within. You could practically hear the disgruntled murmurs growing into open shouts across the vast plains and fertile valleys of China. The Mongols, having alienated the Han Chinese elite and burdened the peasantry with heavy taxes and natural disasters, found their mandate of heaven slipping away. This wasn't just about a change of rulers. It was about a profound yearning for the return of native Chinese governance after nearly a century of foreign domination. The mid-14th century saw widespread famines, devastating floods. The Yellow River, ever a fickle beast, again changed its course, causing immense suffering and a general sense of despair. These natural calamities were of course interpreted as clear signs that heaven had abandoned the Mongol emperors. Local banditry morphed into organized rebellions, often led by charismatic figures from humble backgrounds. It was like 1,000 tiny sparks igniting simultaneously across the empire, quickly merging into a raging inferno. Among the myriad rebel groups, one in particular began to gain momentum: the Red Turban Rebellion. This widespread movement was a blend of Buddhist and Manichaean millenarianism, promising a new, more just world. Many of its leaders were peasants or former monks, embodying the widespread dissatisfaction with the Yuan. You can imagine the fervent speeches, the desperate hope in the eyes of the downtrodden as these leaders promised an end to suffering and the expulsion of the foreign oppressors. But one figure among the red turbans rose above the rest: Zhou Yuanzhang, Gisa. He was a peasant born into abject poverty who had lost his entire family to famine and disease. He even spent time as a mendicant Buddhist monk before joining a local rebel group. Unlike many of his rivals, who were often opportunistic bandits, Zhou Yuanzhang was disciplined, intelligent, and fiercely ambitious. He learned quickly from his mistakes and demonstrated remarkable strategic acumen. Imagine him a determined, unyielding figure, his eyes burning with the memory of hardship, systematically building his power base. He wasn't just fighting for survival, he was fighting to avenge his family and reclaim his homeland. An authoritative historical fact is that Zhu Yuanzhang gradually consolidated control over the fragmented rebel forces, defeated his main rivals, most notably Chen Yuliang in the decisive Battle of Lake Poyang in 1363, one of the largest naval battles in history, and eventually marched on Dadu, the Yuan capital. In Ko, May 1368 CE, he proclaimed the establishment of the Ming Dynasty, taking the title of Emperor Hongwu and officially driving the Mongols back to the northern steppes. This marked the return of an ethnic Han Chinese dynasty after a century of foreign rule, a moment of immense national pride and cultural significance. For a quirky or off-topic fact, Emperor Hongwu was famously paranoid about corruption and disloyalty, likely due to his humble origins and the treachery he witnessed during the chaotic end of the Yuan. He implemented extremely harsh anti-corruption measures, including publicly flaying officials and displaying their skins as a warning. So while he was establishing a new era of Chinese rule, he was also making sure everyone knew he meant business, perhaps a little too literally. Talk about workplace incentives. The Ming Dynasty, established by a peasant, immediately set about undoing many of the Mongol policies and restoring traditional Chinese institutions. Zhu Yuanzhang as Emperor Hongwu was a tireless and autocratic ruler. He centralized power to an unprecedented degree, largely abolishing the prime ministership to prevent any single official from accumulating too much authority. He revived and significantly strengthened the civil service examination system, ensuring that the government was once again staffed by Confucian scholars, restoring the traditional elite. He also implemented sweeping land reforms aiming to redistribute land to the peasantry and alleviate poverty. He ordered the planting of millions of trees, undertook massive public works projects, though with more care than the Sui, and developed a more equitable tax system. Historians still debate whether Emperor Hongwu's autocratic tendencies and brutal purges of officials were a necessary evil to re-establish order after the chaos of the Yuan, or if they laid the groundwork for future imperial despotism. Was his harshness a pragmatic response to a fractured society, or an inherent flaw that would define his reign? It's a compelling question with no easy answers. The early Ming under Emperor Hongwu was a period of stability, economic recovery, and a reassertion of Chinese cultural identity. It was a conscious effort to erase the foreign imprint of the Yuan and return to what was perceived as a purer, more glorious Chinese past. This sense of renewal and confidence would soon manifest itself in grand projects and ambitious overseas ventures, demonstrating that China was not merely recovering, but once again poised to project its power and influence across the globe. As the Ming Dynasty pushed into its final century, the grand expeditions and cultural flourishing of its earlier years seemed a distant memory. You could sense a creeping malaise, a growing internal rot that belied the empire's outward grandeur. The vibrant spirit of Zheng He's voyages had long faded, replaced by an increasingly inward-looking government riddled with corruption, economic problems, and factional infighting. It was like a magnificent aging mansion, still impressive from the outside, but with leaky roofs, crumbling foundations, and a staff more interested in their own squabbles than maintaining the estate. The primary culprit for this decay beyond the natural ebb and flow of dynastic cycles was often the growing power of eunuchs at court. They wielded immense influence, controlling access to the emperor, manipulating appointments, and often engaging in widespread corruption that crippled the bureaucracy and alienated honest officials. You could almost hear the whispered conspiracies in the palace corridors, the backroom deals that chipped away at the empire's vitality. This internal strife led to a profound disconnect between the central government and the suffering populace, especially the peasantry who bore the brunt of heavy taxes and neglect. Imagine a giant corporation where the CEOs are too busy arguing over who gets the biggest corner office to notice the company is going bankrupt. This simmering discontent, fueled by economic hardship, periodic natural disasters like devastating famines, and government incompetence, inevitably erupted into massive peasant rebellions. The most significant of these was led by Li Zicheng, a former postal worker who, after losing his job due to budget cuts, became a charismatic rebel leader. His forces gained immense strength, appealing to the desperate and dispossessed. You can picture the surge of hope and desperation among the common people as Li Zicheng's armies, promising relief from oppressive taxes and a fairer society, swept across the countryside. While the Ming was collapsing from within, a new power was consolidating its strength in the northeast. These were the Kanami Manchu's descendants of the Jurchen people who had once established the Qin Dynasty in the north centuries ago. Under dynamic leaders like Cecin Nurhaci and his son, Hong Taiji, the various Jurchen tribes were unified, adopting Chinese administrative practices, developing their own written script, and forming a formidable military force known as the Eight Banners. They saw themselves as the rightful heirs to the mandate of heaven, patiently waiting for their moment to strike a weakened Ming. Imagine a disciplined, organized group of neighbors watching your house fall apart, just waiting for the perfect moment to move in. The Ming Dynasty finally met its dramatic end, not at the hands of the Manchus initially, but a peasant army. An authoritative historical fact is that in Lefruchio, April 1644, Li Zicheng's rebel army captured Beijing. And the last Ming emperor, the Chongzhen emperor, tragically hanged himself on a tree behind the Forbidden City. This was the moment the mandate of heaven definitively left the Ming. China's capital was in the hands of a peasant rebel, not a foreign conqueror. However, the story doesn't end there. As Li Zicheng consolidated his control over Beijing, a critical figure emerged: Wu Sangui. A powerful Ming general guarding Shanhai Pass, the strategic easternmost point of the Great Wall, which controlled the entry into China proper from Manchuria. Wu Sangui was faced with an impossible choice: align with the peasant rebels who had overthrown his emperor, or seek aid from the Manchu barbarians he had long defended against. Historians still debate whether Wu Sangui's decision was primarily motivated by loyalty to the Ming, seeking revenge for the emperor's death, by personal ambition, or by a deep-seated contempt for Li Zicheng's peasant regime. Whatever his exact reasoning, he made a fateful choice. For a quirky or off-topic fact, the queue, that long braided hairstyle worn by Manchu men and later imposed on Han Chinese men by the Qing, was originally a practical hairstyle for horse riding, keeping hair out of the way. It became a powerful symbol of submission to Qing rule, a highly visible sign of loyalty or lack thereof. So if you were a Han Chinese man, you literally had to get your hair done a certain way to show you were on the right side of history, or else. Wu Sangui opened the gates of Shanhai Pass, allowing the Manchu army to pour through. The Manchus, under the leadership of Prince Dogon, regent for the young Emperor Shunji, quickly routed Li Zicheng's peasant forces and then marched directly into Beijing. The Qing Dynasty was formally established in the capital later in Mach 1640. Marking the beginning of a new era of foreign rule, though one that would prove far more successful and long-lasting than the Yuan. The Manchu conquest of the rest of China was not immediate. It took decades of brutal warfare to suppress remaining Ming loyalists and various rebel factions, a process often marked by fierce resistance and horrific massacres like the Yangzhou massacre. But the Qing, with their superior military organization, their strategic alliances, including defecting Han Chinese generals like Wu Sangui, and their willingness to adopt Chinese administrative practices, steadily extended their control. You can almost feel the grinding inevitability of their conquest province by province as they cemented their new empire. This marked a profound shift in China's destiny, ushering in the last great imperial dynasty, one that would stretch for nearly 3 centuries and face challenges from both within and a rapidly changing outside world. With Beijing firmly in their grasp and the last Ming emperor, a tragic memory, the Manchu rulers, now masters of China, embarked on the monumental task of consolidating their new empire. You could almost hear the collective sigh of resignation from many Han Chinese, coupled with the grim determination of others who still resisted. This wasn't a quick or easy takeover. It was a decades-long process of conquest, pacification, and crucially legitimization. The new dynasty, the Qing, understood that military might alone wasn't enough. They needed to win the hearts and minds, or at least the grudging acceptance of their vast Han Chinese subjects. Their initial strategy was pragmatic. While they imposed certain Manchu customs like the infamous Q hairstyle on all Han Chinese men as a sign of submission, they largely retained the Ming administrative system, the civil service examination, and the Confucian bureaucracy. This allowed for a degree of continuity that eased the transition for many. Imagine stepping into a new job and, while the boss has changed the office layout and your daily tasks are largely familiar. This careful balance of Manchu identity and Chinese governance was key to their long-term success. The true strength of the Qing dynasty emerged under a series of incredibly capable emperors, often referred to as the Kangxian Golden Age. The first of these great rulers was the Kangxi Emperor, who reigned for an astonishing 61 years, 1661–1722. You can picture him a diligent intellectual and militarily brilliant ruler who ascended the throne as a child and grew into one of China's most revered monarchs. He personally led military campaigns, oversaw massive public works, and was a keen patron of arts and scholarship. He even learned some Western science and mathematics from Jesuit missionaries, demonstrating a surprising openness for his time. An authoritative historical fact is that the Kangxi Emperor successfully suppressed the revolt of the three feudatories, 1673 to 1681. A massive rebellion by three powerful Han Chinese generals, including our old friend Wu Sangui, who apparently thought he could carve out his own kingdom, who had been instrumental in the Manchu conquest, but then defied Qing authority. This victory solidified Manchu rule over all of China proper and was a pivotal moment in ensuring the dynasty's long-term stability. It proved that the Qing was not just a temporary foreign occupation, but a legitimate, powerful new empire. For a quirky or off-topic fact, the Kangxi Emperor was quite the enthusiast for Western clockwork mechanisms. He collected hundreds of elaborate European clocks and even had a workshop established in the palace to repair and produce them. So while much of China was still operating on sundials and traditional timekeeping, the emperor was probably listening to the intricate ticking of Swiss-made movements, trying to figure out how they worked. It's a fun little detail that shows how even the most powerful rulers could be fascinated by the exotic. Following Kangxi came his son, the Yongzheng Emperor. Reigned 1722–1735, a diligent and ruthless administrator who further centralized imperial power, streamlined government finances, and cracked down on corruption. He was a behind-the-scenes workhorse, ensuring the bureaucratic machinery ran smoothly like a stern but efficient CEO who gets all the paperwork done. He strengthened the imperial treasury and ensured the empire was financially ready for the next generation. And that next generation brought the Qing to its zenith under the Qianlong Emperor. Reigned 1735–1796, who ruled for 60 years, deliberately 1 year less than his grandfather Kangxi out of respect. You can imagine him a man of immense cultural refinement and imperial confidence, presiding over an empire that had expanded to its greatest territorial extent, encompassing vast swathes of Mongolia, Tibet, and Xinjiang. This was the peak of Qing power and prosperity, an era of unprecedented population growth, agricultural output, and cultural flourishing. Under Qianlong, the empire's wealth allowed for immense cultural patronage. Massive encyclopedias were compiled, new literary forms emerged, and porcelain production reached new artistic heights. The population swelled to over 300 million, fed by new crops like sweet potatoes and corn introduced from the Americas. Historians still debate whether the Kangqian Golden Age, for all its splendor, inadvertently sowed the seeds of the Qing's later decline by fostering a sense of complacency and resistance to change in a rapidly evolving world. Was this Golden Age merely the calm before the storm, or did it create the very conditions for future stagnation? This was a period of immense confidence for China. The Qing emperors, while Manchu had fully embraced their roles as sons of heaven, ruling an empire that stretched further than any previous Chinese dynasty. They saw no equals, and indeed few genuinely existed on the global stage at the time. Yet just as the Qing enjoyed its golden twilight, distant thunderclouds were gathering on the horizon. The industrializing powers of Europe, particularly Great Britain, were increasingly looking eastward, not with deference, but with a growing appetite for trade and influence, setting the stage for a dramatic clash of civilizations that would fundamentally reshape China's destiny. The Qing dynasty, having reached its apex under the long and seemingly glorious reigns of Kangxi and Qianlong, found itself increasingly confronted by a world it barely understood and certainly didn't respect. You could almost feel the deep-seated confidence emanating from Beijing, a serene belief in China's immutable position as the Middle Kingdom, the cultural and political center of the universe. All other nations were in this worldview either barbarian tributaries, or at best distant realms of minor importance existing solely to offer deference and perhaps a few exotic trinkets. This mindset, while comforting, was about to clash spectacularly with the burgeoning industrializing powers of the West, particularly Britain. Imagine a meticulously choreographed dance, but only one side knew the steps. European traders, particularly the British, were desperate for Chinese goods, especially tea silk and porcelain. You might picture a Georgian-era British drawing room awash in the fragrant steam of Chinese tea, an essential part of daily life. The demand for these luxuries was insatiable, but China, largely self-sufficient, had little interest in European manufactured goods. This created a massive trade imbalance. Silver flowed into China from Europe to pay for all those teas and silks, and very little flowed out. It was a financial drain on the British treasury, like constantly filling a bathtub with water, only for the drain to be wide open on your end. For centuries, China had successfully managed this trade through the Canton system, named after the port city of Guangzhou, also known as Canton. An authoritative historical fact is that from 1757 to 1842, the Canton system strictly limited all foreign trade to the single port of Canton and imposed numerous restrictions on foreign merchants, including prohibiting direct contact with the Chinese population and forcing them to trade only through a select group of Chinese merchants known as the Kohong. Imagine trying to run a global business where you could only enter one small room, talk to specific people, and only sell certain things. It was incredibly restrictive, and frankly, China saw no reason to change it. "You want our goods? You play by our rules," was the unspoken mantra. The European goods offered, like woolens, clocks, and manufactured trinkets, often struck the Chinese as rather quaint or even crude. Oh, bless their hearts. You can almost hear a Qing official scoffing, "They're trying to sell us wool in China." The British, however, were not about to take no for an answer. Their solution to the trade imbalance was insidious and ultimately catastrophic for China. Opium. This highly addictive narcotic produced in British India was smuggled into China on an ever-increasing scale. You can almost feel the desperate clutches of addiction taking hold, the vibrant city streets slowly becoming filled with gaunt figures in opium dens, their lives and fortunes draining away. The social and economic fabric of coastal China began to fray as addiction soared, creating a massive public health crisis and a significant outflow of silver from China to pay for the drug. It was a dark irony. The very silver that had flowed into China was now flowing out, fueling a terrible addiction. It's like finding out your new favorite binge-watching show is secretly causing your apartment to flood. The Qing government, initially slow to grasp the full extent of the problem, finally realized the catastrophic scale of the opium trade. Emperor Daoguang appointed Commissioner Lin Zexu to crack down on the illicit trade. Lin Zexu was a man of integrity and determination. He launched an aggressive campaign arresting dealers, confiscating opium, and demanding that foreign merchants surrender their stocks. His most famous act, and an authoritative historical fact, was the destruction of over 20,000 chests of confiscated opium at Human near Canton in 1839. This act, seen as a necessary moral stand by the Chinese, was viewed by the British as an outrageous attack on their property and a direct affront to free trade. The British government, egged on by powerful merchants and feeling the economic sting of the trade imbalance, used Lin Zexu's actions as a pretext for war. It wasn't really about the right to sell opium. It was about forcing open China's markets and asserting British imperial power. You can almost hear the indignation in London. How dare they destroy our ahem property? The resulting conflict from 1839 to 1842 was the First Opium War. It was a tragically unequal contest. The technologically superior British Navy, armed with steam-powered gunboats and advanced artillery, easily outmatched China's traditional junks and outdated military. It was less of a fair fight and more like a modern tank trying to defeat a historical trebuchet. The war ended in a humiliating defeat for the Qing, forcing them to sign the Yik Treaty of Nanjing in 1842. This was the first of the unequal treaties that would define China's interactions with Western powers for the next century. China was forced to pay a large indemnity, open 5 new treaty ports to foreign trade, abolish the Kohong monopoly, and most significantly cede Hong Kong Island to Britain in perpetuity. Furthermore, British citizens in China were granted extraterritoriality, meaning they were subject to British law, not Chinese law, even on Chinese soil. It was a profound blow to Chinese sovereignty and a shattering of the Middle Kingdom illusion. The First Opium War was followed by further Western pressure, and eventually the Second Opium War. 1856–1860, also known as the Arrow War, in which British and French forces further humiliated China, sacking and burning the old summer palace Yuanmingyuan outside Beijing. More treaty ports were opened, foreign diplomats were allowed into Beijing, and the opium trade was effectively legalized. The Qing court, despite these defeats, remained remarkably slow to adapt, clinging to traditional ways and underestimating the scale of the threat. Historians still debate whether China's insular foreign policy was a justifiable preservation of sovereignty and cultural identity, or a fatal miscalculation that left them vulnerable to Western aggression. Was the Qing's reluctance to engage with the West simply stubbornness, or a deeply ingrained cultural confidence that simply couldn't conceive of another nation being superior? This era marked the painful beginning of China's century of humiliation, a period of foreign encroachment and internal weakness that would profoundly shape its modern history. The humiliating defeats of the Opium Wars and the imposition of the unequal treaties shattered the Qing dynasty's illusion of invincibility, but they were just the opening act for an even more devastating period of internal turmoil. You can almost feel the foundations of the empire begin to tremble, not just from external pressure, but from the deep cracks appearing within. The foreign incursions, while painful, exposed and exacerbated long-standing issues of corruption, famine, and a rapidly growing population that the Qing government was increasingly incapable of managing. Imagine millions of frustrated peasants, their lives already hard, now facing increased taxes, often to pay for war indemnities, floods, and official corruption that seemed to get worse by the day. The traditional social order once held sacred was fraying. This simmering discontent erupted into a series of massive internal rebellions that dwarfed the foreign wars in their scale and devastation. These weren't just localized uprisings, they were nationwide movements that threatened to topple the Qing from within. The most cataclysmic of these was the Taiping Rebellion, which raged from 1850 to 1864. An authoritative historical fact is that this rebellion, led by Hong Xiuquan, a man who claimed to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ after failing the civil service exams multiple times and experiencing visions, was a millenarian movement advocating for a new social and religious order. The Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, as he called it, aimed to overthrow the Qing, abolish private property, and establish a society based on gender equality and a unique blend of Christian and Chinese beliefs. Imagine a self-proclaimed divine emperor leading millions of fervent followers fighting for a radical social transformation. It was a truly revolutionary and terrifying force. The Taiping rebels, organized into a highly disciplined and often fanatical army, swept across southern and central China, capturing major cities like Nanjing, which they made their capital. You can picture the sheer terror and chaos as these armies, driven by religious zeal, battled Qing forces. The rebellion was fought with incredible ferocity on both sides and resulted in an estimated 20 to 30 million deaths, making it one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. To put that in perspective, that's more than World War I and II combined for some countries. For a quirky or off-topic fact, the Taiping rebels actually banned opium, tobacco, and alcohol within their territories, and even practiced gender segregation with separate armies for men and women. So, while they were fighting for a new heaven on earth, they were also acting like the strictest parental unit in history, trying to get everyone to behave perfectly. It just goes to show even revolutionaries have their rules. The Qing government, weakened by the Opium Wars, struggled immensely to suppress the Taiping Rebellion. They had to rely heavily on regional armies led by Han Chinese scholar generals like Zheng Guofan and Li Hongzhang. These regional armies, often more effective than the imperial banner forces, eventually succeeded in crushing the Taiping, but their rise further decentralized power and created powerful provincial figures who would challenge central authority in the future. Historians still debate whether the Qing could have survived without the intervention of these powerful Han Chinese generals, or if the dynasty's fate was already sealed by its internal decay. Was it a rescue, or just a temporary reprieve? But the Taiping was not the only fire consuming the Qing. Other major uprisings included the Pan-Nian Rebellion in the north, 1853–1868, which was more agrarian and less religiously motivated, and various Muslim rebellions in the southwest and northwest, such as the Panthay Rebellion, 1856–1873, and the Dungan Revolt, 1860–1877. These simultaneous, widespread rebellions further stretched the Qing's resources and manpower, leaving the empire exhausted and vulnerable. The scale of these internal conflicts was devastating. Vast areas of the countryside were laid, waste populations were decimated, and the Qing central government's prestige and authority plummeted. The foreign powers, observing this internal chaos, often took advantage, pushing for more concessions and further entrenching their influence. It was a tragic cycle. Internal weakness led to foreign encroachment, which in turn fueled more internal unrest. The Qing dynasty, once so confident, was now fighting for its very survival on multiple fronts, struggling to hold together an empire that seemed intent on tearing itself apart. The end, though still decades away, was becoming an increasingly inevitable prospect. The 19th century was a slow, agonizing death for the Qing Dynasty. You could feel the weight of centuries of tradition pressing down, unable to adapt to the relentless tide of change. The internal rebellions, though eventually suppressed, had left the empire bled dry and profoundly weakened, while the Western powers continued their relentless push for concessions, carving out spheres of influence and eroding Chinese sovereignty. It was like a majestic old tree, its trunk hollowed out by termites, now being battered by a series of increasingly violent storms. The Qing court, nestled in the Forbidden City, largely failed to grasp the existential nature of the threat. There were attempts at reform known as the self-strengthening movement. Roughly 1861 to 1895, where some progressive officials sought to adopt Western military technology and industrial methods, while preserving traditional Chinese culture and institutions. Imagine them trying to graft modern engines onto ancient junks, hoping to compete with steamships. While some arsenals and shipyards were built, these efforts were piecemeal, lacking central coordination, and often hampered by bureaucratic inertia and conservative opposition. Why adopt barbarian ways? Many argued, when our own ways are superior. This mindset was a fatal flaw in a rapidly modernizing world. An authoritative historical fact is that the Qing dynasty suffered a humiliating defeat in the First Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895. Japan, a small island nation that had rapidly modernized after the Meiji Restoration, easily defeated the supposedly self-strengthened Chinese forces, exposing the Qing's military weakness and technological backwardness to the entire world. This defeat was particularly shocking because it was at the hands of an Asian power, further shattering the illusion of China's regional dominance. You can feel the collective gasp of disbelief across China as news of the defeat spread. For a quirky or off-topic fact, during the Boxer Rebellion, some foreign legations in Beijing used champagne bottles as improvised hand grenades, filling them with gunpowder and shrapnel. So while diplomatic relations were exploding, literally, resourceful defenders were making sure no good bottle of bubbly went to waste. It just goes to show desperation can be the mother of very unfestive invention. The humiliation of the Sino-Japanese War led to a scramble by foreign powers to demand even more concessions, threatening to partition China outright. This rising foreign encroachment, coupled with deep resentment towards Christian missionaries and foreign influence, sparked the Boxer Rebellion. 1899–1901. This was a violent anti-foreign, anti-Christian uprising by a group known as the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, hence Boxers. They believed they were invulnerable to foreign weapons and attacked foreign legations in Beijing. You can imagine the desperate, often chaotic scenes as these rebels, armed with little more than traditional weapons and fervent belief, confronted the might of modern armies. The Qing court, under the vacillating Empress Dowager Cixi, initially supported the Boxers, declaring war on the foreign powers. This led to the formation of the Eight-Nation Alliance, including Japan, Russia, Britain, France, the United States, Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, which brutally suppressed the rebellion and marched on Beijing, sacking the capital once again. This definitive historical event and the subsequent Boxer Protocol imposed massive indemnities on China and further entrenched foreign control, leaving the Qing government in an almost irreversible state of subservience. Historians still debate whether the Qing dynasty could have survived if it had embraced more radical reforms earlier, or if its fate was sealed by the sheer scale of the challenges it faced from both internal decay and external imperial pressures. Was it a fundamental resistance to change, or simply too much too fast? The early 20th century saw a series of internal crises. Calls for constitutional monarchy and republicanism grew louder among intellectuals and reformers. The Qing attempts at belated reform, like abolishing the ancient civil service examination system in 1905, were too little too late. The centralized control continued to erode, with powerful provincial strongmen emerging. You could feel the revolutionary fervor building, a deep yearning for a complete overhaul of the old order. Finally, in Wolof 1911, a revolutionary uprising, often called the Xinhai Revolution, broke out in Wuchang. It quickly spread across the provinces, leading to declarations of independence from Qing rule. The imperial court, now bereft of authority and military power, was powerless to stop it. On a fête, February 12, 1912, the last emperor, Puyi, a child of 6, formally abdicated, bringing an end to the Qing Dynasty, and with it over 2 millennia of continuous imperial rule in China. The sun had finally set on the dragon throne, ushering in an uncertain, turbulent new era of republicanism and profound change. The long, winding story of the Chinese dynasties had finally come to an end, or at least a grand pause. The long journey through the Chinese dynasties concludes, leaving us with a tapestry woven from myth and bronze, philosophy and steel. From the shadowy figures of the Xia and Shang through the philosophical ferment of the Zhou, we witness the Qin's brutal unifying force, only to see it quickly collapse, replaced by the enduring Han's golden age. We traversed periods of agonizing division, the vibrant clash of cultures during the northern and southern dynasties, before the Sui briefly reunited, paving the way for the dazzling cosmopolitanism of the Tang. The refined Song brought intellectual brilliance and technological innovation, even as the northern nomads pressed in, eventually leading to the foreign rule of the Mongol Yuan. Finally, the native Ming restored China's pride, venturing far before retreating inward, only to eventually succumb to the Manchu Qing, whose grand empire slowly, painfully crumbled under the weight of internal strife and the relentless pressure of a new global order. The story of Imperial China is a cyclical dance of rise and fall, unification and fragmentation, a testament to human ingenuity, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of order in a vast, complex land. It's a tale of emperors and peasants, scholars and warriors, all caught in the inexorable flow of history, reminding us that even the mightiest empires are but fleeting moments in the grand expanse of time. Good night.